Close your eyes and imagine a fairy tale turned nightmare. A world where the promise of life without strings became the very chains that bound humanity to its doom. Where a father's love twisted into obsession so profound it would condemn an entire city to madness. Where the dream of becoming real meant sacrificing everything that made existence worth living. This is Krat. A gleaming jewel of the Belle Époque, a city of art and innovation, clockwork and dreams. It was a place where science and alchemy walked hand in hand through cobblestone streets lit by gas lamps and ambition. Where puppets served humanity's every need, tireless and obedient, the perfect servants for a perfect age. But perfection is always a lie. And in Krat, that lie wore a wooden face and spoke with borrowed words. Tonight, we journey through the complete tragedy of Lies of P. From the city's golden age when Geppetto was hailed as humanity's greatest craftsman, through the night the puppets rose with blades in their hands, to the terrible truth hidden beneath every kind word and gentle gesture. This is not the story of a wooden boy who wanted to become real. This is the story of what it costs to be human, and whether that cost can ever be worth paying. We will walk through streets slick with oil and blood. We will meet the survivors clinging to hope in Hotel Krat while the city burns around them. We will uncover what Ergo truly is, why Geppetto needed it so desperately, and what Simon Manus saw in the petrification disease that drove him to embrace monstrosity as salvation. We will trace how a city built on harvested souls convinced itself that progress justified any price, how families watched their loved ones turn to stone while alchemists promised cures they could never deliver, how friendship between boys became the foundation for resurrection schemes that would murder thousands. We will learn why the puppets killed, but more importantly, we will learn why they were created in the first place. We will discover that the puppet frenzy was not the beginning of Krat's tragedy but merely the moment when decades of accumulated sins erupted into violence that could no longer be hidden or explained away. We will understand that every comfortable lie the city told itself about progress and civilization was built on uncomfortable truths about what happens when you treat consciousness as a resource to be harvested and souls as fuel to be burned. This is a story about fathers and sons, about the lengths people will go to avoid accepting loss, about the price of resurrection and the cost of refusing to let the dead rest. It is about consciousness emerging in places it was never meant to exist, about puppets learning to lie and humans forgetting how to tell truth from comfortable fiction. It is about a city that reached too far, grasped too much, and paid for its ambition with blood and oil mixing in gutters that had once run clean. So settle in, let the rain wash away the outside world, and prepare yourself for a fairy tale with no happy ending. A story where becoming real means losing everything. Where every answer raises darker questions. Where the only certainty is that in Krat, everyone pays for their dreams in blood, tears, and the slow erosion of everything they once believed was true. This is Lies of P. And by the end, you will understand why that title cuts deeper than any blade. This video contains complete spoilers for Lies of P, including all major story revelations, character fates, boss identities, and ending variations. If the mysteries of Krat still call to those listening, consider returning after witnessing them firsthand. For everyone else, let us begin where all tragedies begin, with hope. Krat was not always a city of corpses and broken puppets. There was a time, not so long ago by history's measure but lifetimes away in memory, when Krat represented humanity's brightest future. The Belle Époque had touched this city with particular favor, transforming it into a showcase of what mankind could achieve when art and science walked hand in hand. The streets were marvels of urban planning, designed by architects who believed that beauty and function could coexist in perfect harmony. Gas lamps lined boulevards where citizens strolled in their finest clothes, silk and velvet glowing in the evening light as they discussed opera performances at the Grand Theatre, or the latest philosophical treatises being debated at the university. The architecture mixed classical elegance with industrial ambition in ways that should have clashed but somehow sang together. Grand theaters stood beside puppet workshops, their facades decorated with the same attention to detail. Opera houses neighbored factories, and both were considered equally important to the city's cultural identity. The Rosa Isabel Street was particularly famous, a wide boulevard where the wealthy paraded in carriages pulled by the finest horses, though even then some visionaries spoke of the day when puppets might pull those carriages instead, freeing the animals from their labor. The street cafes overflowed with artists and intellectuals arguing about the nature of progress, about whether Krat's rapid advancement was bringing humanity closer to some ideal state, or merely replacing one form of bondage with another. Krat's prosperity was not accidental. The city sat at a convergence of trade routes, its port handling goods from across the known world. But more than geographical advantage, Krat had vision. The city's founders, generations before the Belle Époque, had established principles of innovation and excellence that attracted the brightest minds of each age. The University of Krat was renowned across nations. The hospitals pioneered techniques that saved lives other cities would have lost. The workshops produced craftsmanship that commanded premium prices in foreign markets. Central to this vision was the Workshop Union, a collection of Krat's finest craftsmen and engineers, alchemists and visionaries. It had started as a simple guild, a way for puppet makers to share techniques and maintain quality standards. But over time, as puppet technology grew more sophisticated, as the possibilities expanded, the Workshop Union became something more powerful. It became the true power in Krat, more influential than the nominal government, more wealthy than the old aristocracy, more essential to daily life than any church or institution. The Workshop Union had achieved something remarkable, something that seemed impossible until they proved otherwise. They had created puppets, mechanical servants powered by a mysterious substance called ergo, capable of performing any task given to them. These were not simple automatons grinding through repetitive motions. These were sophisticated machines that could understand complex instructions, adapt to new situations, learn from experience in limited ways, and serve humanity with tireless dedication that never wavered, never complained, never demanded rest or reward. The first puppets had been crude things, little more than mobile tools, useful but obviously mechanical. But each generation improved on the last. Geppetto and his contemporaries in the Workshop Union pushed the boundaries of what puppets could be, could do, could understand. They developed better ergo cores that provided more power and enabled more complex behaviors. They refined the mechanical systems until puppet movements became almost graceful, almost alive. They programmed increasingly sophisticated instruction sets that allowed puppets to handle situations their creators had never specifically anticipated. The breakthrough came when they discovered how to make puppets truly adaptable. Before this, a puppet could only do what it was specifically programmed to do. A puppet built to sweep floors could sweep floors magnificently but could not be asked to wash windows without complete reprogramming. The new puppets could take general instructions and figure out how to accomplish them, could encounter obstacles and devise solutions, could learn from one task and apply that learning to another. This was when puppets transformed Krat's society entirely. Manual labor became obsolete almost overnight. Why employ human workers for dangerous mining when puppets felt no fear of cave-ins and never tired no matter how deep they dug? Why risk human lives in factory work when puppets could operate machinery without the possibility of distraction or error? Why have humans haul cargo at the docks when puppets could work through storms and darkness without complaint? Dangerous work could be delegated to machines that felt no pain and feared no injury. Tedious work could be assigned to servants who never grew bored or resentful. The citizens of Krat found themselves freed from drudgery, able to pursue higher callings, to create art and music, to philosophize and dream. The working classes initially protested, fearing unemployment, but the Workshop Union promised that freed from physical labor, humans could all become artisans, thinkers, creators. The economy would shift from manufacturing and hauling to design and innovation. Everyone would benefit. And for a time, it seemed true. The economy did not collapse when puppets replaced workers. Instead, it transformed. Humans moved into supervisory roles, maintenance positions, creative fields. Krat's output increased dramatically while working hours for humans decreased. The city grew wealthy on exports produced by tireless puppet labor, and crafted to standards impossible when humans did the work. The standard of living rose. Life expectancy increased. Culture flourished. It seemed like paradise achieved through human ingenuity. The perfect merger of mechanical efficiency and human creativity. The puppets would do everything that was unpleasant or dangerous, and humans would do everything that was interesting or meaningful. It was the dream of every utopian philosopher, realized in brass and ergo. But there were signs, for those who looked, that the dream had costs not everyone acknowledged. The ergo needed to power all these puppets had to come from somewhere. The workshop union was vague about sourcing. They spoke of harvesting natural ergo crystallization and ethical collection methods, without explaining what those phrases actually meant. Some workers at ergo processing facilities whispered about things they had seen, about where the crystals really came from, but these whispers were dismissed as the complaints of those displaced by progress. The puppets themselves sometimes behaved in ways that suggested something more than mere programming. There were reports, never officially investigated, of puppets pausing in their work as if lost in thought. Of puppets that seemed reluctant to perform certain tasks, as if something in them resisted despite the Grand Covenant's absolute obedience. Of puppets that moved more slowly when approaching tasks that involved destroying other puppets, as if something in them recognized kinship even though they theoretically possessed no such concept. These anomalies were explained away as minor glitches, programming quirks that would be resolved in the next generation. The workshop union issued reassurances. The Grand Covenant was absolute. The puppets could never pose a threat. Trust in progress. Trust in science. Trust in the vision of a better tomorrow. And the people of Krat did trust, because the alternative was acknowledging that their paradise might be built on foundations they did not want to examine, that their freedom from labor might come at costs paid by entities they preferred to think of as mere machines rather than as something that might, in however fragmented a form, possess awareness. At the pinnacle of this achievement stood Geppetto, the greatest puppet craftsman who had ever lived. His workshop in the heart of Krat, on Via della Rosa near the Grand Cathedral, produced marvels that other craftsmen could only envy and never quite replicate. His puppets moved with grace that almost resembled life, each gesture flowing into the next with none of the jerky transitions that plagued lesser craftsmen's work. They could perform tasks of incredible complexity, following instructions with nuance that suggested understanding rather than mere execution. Some whispered that Geppetto's creations were more than mere machines, that they possessed something approaching true consciousness, though Geppetto himself always dismissed such claims. "Consciousness requires a soul," he would say in his rare public appearances. "My puppets have only excellent programming and superior mechanical design." But those who watched his puppets closely noticed things. The way they would pause before beginning a task, as if considering it. The way they moved around obstacles with creativity rather than pre-programmed pathways. The way some of them seemed almost hesitant when ordered to destroy other puppets during maintenance operations. Geppetto's techniques were partially trade secrets, partially innovation so advanced that even if he explained them, few could replicate them. He had pioneered new ergo core configurations that provided unprecedented power and stability. He had developed joint systems that allowed for range of motion matching or exceeding human flexibility. His puppets' hands could perform surgery, paint masterpieces, craft delicate clockwork, or haul heavy loads with equal facility. But beyond the technical mastery, Geppetto brought something else to his craft. Obsessive perfectionism bordering on the pathological. He would rebuild a puppet dozens of times if some minor detail of its movement displeased him. He would spend weeks adjusting a puppet's facial mechanisms so its expressions would be precisely correct, even though most puppets never needed to make expressions at all. His work consumed him in ways that made other craftsmen uncomfortable. They built puppets to perform functions. Geppetto built puppets as if trying to achieve some ideal he could never quite articulate. Geppetto himself was a figure of respect and mystery in Krat's social hierarchies. He was celebrated publicly, invited to all the finest social events, honored by the city's elite. But he rarely attended these functions, and when he did, he seemed uncomfortable, eager to return to his workshop. His brilliant colleagues would engage in grand debates about the future of puppet technology, the ethics of ergo harvesting, the ultimate potential of their craft. Geppetto listened but rarely participated, as if his thoughts were elsewhere, as if the conversations around him touched only surface matters while he contemplated depths others could not fathom. He had been married once. His wife had died in childbirth, a tragedy that sent Geppetto into a grief from which he never fully emerged. The child survived, Carlo, a son who became everything to Geppetto, the one thing in his life more important than his craft. For a few years after Carlo's birth, Geppetto's work actually slowed. He spent time with his infant son, his toddler son, his young boy, trying to be the father his own father had never been. But as Carlo grew older, became more independent, began his own education at Monad Charity House, Geppetto returned to his workshop with renewed intensity. Now his perfectionism had new meaning. He was building a better world for Carlo to inherit. His puppets would ensure Carlo never had to do dangerous or demeaning work. His innovations would establish wealth that would last generations. Everything was for Carlo, though Carlo himself might have preferred more time with his father over more revolutionary puppet designs. Carlo was a bright boy, well liked by his peers, excelling in his studies. He had his father's intelligence but tempered with social grace Geppetto lacked. Where Geppetto was withdrawn and obsessive, Carlo was warm and engaging. Where Geppetto saw people as problems to solve or obstacles to navigate, Carlo genuinely enjoyed human company, made friends easily, built connections that Geppetto had never bothered with. At Monad Charity House, an elite institution that trained Krat's future leaders, Carlo formed friendships that would echo through the tragedy to come. The school itself was a marvel, funded by wealthy families and the workshop union, designed to produce the next generation of leaders who would guide Krat further into its glorious future. The curriculum mixed classical education with modern technical training, philosophy with engineering, art with science. Romeo was Carlo's closest friend, a relationship forged in their first days at Monad and strengthened through years of shared experiences. Romeo came from a merchant family, wealthy but not aristocratic, nouveau riche in a society still figuring out how old hierarchies applied to new wealth. He and Carlo were inseparable, the kind of friendship that seems indestructible in youth, before the world teaches you that nothing is permanent, that even the strongest bonds can break under sufficient pressure. They made promises to each other, as young men do. They swore to always be there for one another, to support each other's dreams, to never let anything come between them. They talked about the future they would build together, how they would take the best of Krat's innovations and improve upon them, how they would lead their generation into an even brighter tomorrow. They believed these promises absolutely, with the certainty only youth can muster. Lampwick was another part of their circle, though his path would diverge in ways none of them could have predicted. Where Carlo and Romeo were serious students with ambitious plans, Lampwick was more carefree, more interested in living for the present than planning for the future. He provided balance to their group, reminding them that life was for experiencing, not just optimizing. These were the golden days, when the future seemed bright and friendships seemed eternal, when Krat's prosperity felt permanent and the puppets seemed like nothing but useful tools, when no one imagined that within a few years, most of them would be dead and the survivors would envy the dead their escape. But Carlo's health was never strong. From childhood, he had been prone to illness, nothing specific, nothing that doctors could definitively diagnose, just a general fragility that meant he tired easily, fell sick more often than his peers, never quite possessed the robust constitution others took for granted. Some whispered that he showed early signs of the petrification disease, though this was never confirmed. The symptoms did not match exactly, but there was something in the way he moved sometimes, a stiffness that came and went, that made people wonder. Geppetto consulted every doctor in Krat, brought in specialists from other cities, spent fortunes on experimental treatments. Nothing helped. Carlo's condition was not worsening rapidly, but it was not improving either, and the fear that it might suddenly deteriorate hung over Geppetto like a shadow that never lifted. What is certain is that Carlo fell ill, gravely so, during his final year at Monad. An illness that started as simple fever and progressed to something worse, something the doctors could not name or treat. He lingered for weeks in his sickbed, growing weaker day by day while Geppetto tried everything, called in every favor, pursued every possible cure no matter how experimental or unlikely. Carlo died in the spring, on a day when the weather was beautiful and the city was celebrating some festival Geppetto could not even remember the name of afterward. He died in his own bed, in his father's house, with Geppetto holding his hand and promising him things would be all right even as they both knew that was a lie. And something in Geppetto died with him. The part that could accept loss, the part that could acknowledge limits, the part that understood that some things cannot be fixed no matter how brilliant you are or how much you care. That part died with Carlo, and what remained was obsession wearing grief's mask. The alchemists held their own position of power in Krat's hierarchy, separate from but equal to the workshop union. Where the craftsmen worked with the physical, the alchemists studied the metaphysical. Where puppets were the union's domain, ergo itself belonged to the alchemists' purview. The alchemists had existed long before the workshop union, tracing their lineage back centuries to when alchemy was still considered more mysticism than science. But the discovery of ergo had transformed their discipline. Here was tangible proof of what they had always theorized, that life itself was a substance that could be studied, manipulated, transformed. Ergo was the philosopher's stone they had sought for generations, except instead of turning lead to gold, it turned death to energy, consciousness to crystal, the soul into something that could be weighed and measured. They studied ergo in laboratories that looked like churches and churches that functioned as laboratories. They developed theories about the nature of existence that blurred the line between natural philosophy and theology. They published papers that were half scientific treatise, half spiritual meditation. Their work was respected but not quite trusted, necessary but slightly unsettling. The alchemists understood things about ergo that the workshop union preferred not to acknowledge. They knew exactly where it came from, what it represented, what harvesting it truly meant. They had developed the processes that allowed ergo to be extracted from the dead, refined, crystallized, prepared for use in puppet cores. They had created the ethical frameworks that justified this harvesting, the philosophical arguments that made it acceptable to power machines with what had once been human consciousness. Not all alchemists were comfortable with these frameworks. Some argued that there were forms of ergo that could be harvested ethically, from natural sources, from willing donors who had consented before death. But these methods produced far less ergo than simply harvesting from the recently deceased, and Krat's puppet economy demanded ever-increasing supplies. The uncomfortable compromise was never explicitly stated but universally understood. Krat would use whatever ergo was available, from whatever sources provided it, and would not investigate too closely where the processing facilities obtained their raw materials. The alchemists would provide the technical processes. The workshop union would build the infrastructure. And everyone else would benefit from the results while asking no questions about costs paid by those who no longer had voices to complain. Among the alchemists, one name carried particular weight and sparked particular controversy: Simon Manus. He was brilliant, perhaps the most gifted alchemist of his generation, with insights into ergo's nature that seemed almost supernatural in their depth and accuracy. Some said he could sense ergo the way others could sense temperature, that he perceived flows and patterns invisible to normal observation. But Simon's brilliance was tinged with something desperate, something hungry, something that made even his colleagues uneasy. He had watched his daughter Sophia suffer, had witnessed her slow transformation from vibrant child to stonebound prisoner, and the experience had broken something fundamental in him. Sophia had been born healthy, a beautiful child who inherited her mother's grace and her father's sharp intelligence. Simon had doted on her, had seen in her the future of his bloodline, had planned the education and opportunities that would allow her to excel even beyond his own achievements. Her mother had died when Sophia was young, an accident in one of the Alchemists' laboratories, crushed by falling equipment during an experiment that Simon had designed. He blamed himself for his wife's death, though the official investigation found no fault in his procedures. But Simon knew. He had been pushing boundaries, testing hypotheses that other alchemists considered too risky. His wife had been helping him, and her death was the cost of his ambition. He swore he would never let ambition claim another loved one. Then Sophia began to petrify. It started in her hand, a small patch of skin that felt harder than it should, that lost its warmth. The doctors assured Simon it was nothing, probably just dry skin, easily treated. But Simon knew better. He had studied enough bodies, seen enough victims, to recognize the petrification's early signs. He tried everything. Every treatment the medical establishment recommended. Every experimental cure other alchemists suggested. Every folk remedy whispered by the desperate. Nothing worked. The petrification spread slowly but inevitably, creeping up her arm, appearing in patches on her legs, crystallizing her flesh centimeter by centimeter. Sophia bore it with remarkable courage. She continued her studies as long as she could move, maintained friendships even as some pulled away in fear of contagion, tried to live as normally as possible even as her body betrayed her. But Simon could see the fear in her eyes, could hear it in her voice when she asked him if there was a cure, if he was making progress, if she would be all right. And he lied to her. Told her he was close to a breakthrough. Told her not to worry. Told her that her father was the greatest alchemist in Krat and would never let anything happen to her. All lies. Because Simon had no cure. He had theories, yes, hypotheses about what was causing the petrification and what might reverse it. But theories were not treatments, and hypotheses did not stop his daughter from turning to stone. Watching her suffer, watching her slowly become a statue of herself, transformed Simon's desperation into something darker. He began to question the assumptions underlying all medical and alchemical practice. Why did everyone assume petrification was a disease to be cured? What if it was something else? What if it was evolution, transformation, the next stage of human development? Stone endured when flesh failed. Stone lasted when organs decayed. Stone could preserve consciousness if the transformation was guided correctly, if the process was not allowed to run wild but was instead carefully controlled. What if petrification was not killing his daughter but transcending her? This line of thinking drove Simon's research into territories that alarmed even the most radical alchemists. He began experimenting on those who had already petrified, trying to determine if consciousness persisted in the stone, if it could be accessed, communicated with, potentially extracted and preserved. His experiments suggested something horrifying and fascinating. Consciousness did persist. The petrified were not dead. They were trapped, aware but unable to move or speak or interact with the world in any way. They were living statues, prisoners in bodies that had become perfect cages. To most, this would be nightmare confirmation that petrification was the worst possible fate. To Simon, it was proof of concept. If consciousness survived the transformation, then the transformation itself was not death. It was merely transition. And if the transition could be controlled, directed, completed properly, then what emerged might be something unprecedented, consciousness freed from biological limitation, awareness preserved in a form that time and disease could never touch. Simon Manus began to believe that petrification was humanity's next step. And he would help it along, would accelerate it, would transform all of Krat if necessary to prove his theory correct, to save his daughter by redefining what saving meant. The petrification disease was Krat's dark secret, the rot at the heart of the Golden Age, the price that was being paid for progress that no one wanted to acknowledge. It struck seemingly at random, though careful study revealed patterns that suggested it was not quite as random as it appeared. Certain bloodlines showed higher susceptibility. Certain professions seemed to correlate with increased risk. Those who worked closely with ergo, who handled it regularly, who spent long hours in areas of high ergo concentration, developed petrification at rates that should have alarmed public health officials but that were instead quietly attributed to coincidence. The disease's progression was horrifyingly consistent. It always began the same way: a small patch of skin that felt harder than it should, that lost its natural warmth and flexibility. The patch would be small initially, easy to hide, easy to dismiss as dry skin or minor irritation. But it would spread, slowly but inexorably, centimeter by centimeter, day by day, turning flesh to stone with such gradual inevitability that victims often did not realize how far it had progressed until significant portions of their body had crystallized. The early stages were almost manageable. Victims could still move, still work, still participate in normal life with only minor accommodations. A stiffened hand could still hold things, if carefully. A partially petrified leg could still bear weight, if you walked slowly. Life continued with increasing difficulty but without complete incapacitation. But as the disease progressed, as more flesh turned to stone, movement became increasingly difficult. Joints that had partially crystallized could not bend as they should. Muscles that had turned to stone could not contract. The body became a prison, mobility decreasing day by day until victims found themselves trapped in their own transforming frames. The worst aspect, the truly horrifying element that distinguished petrification from merely fatal diseases, was that consciousness persisted. Victims remained aware even as their bodies became stone. They could feel the transformation happening, could sense their flesh crystallizing, could experience the slow loss of their ability to move or speak or interact with the world in any way. Advanced cases were essentially living statues. Fully aware, still thinking and feeling, but unable to move or communicate, trapped in bodies that had become more prison than vessel. Some victims' eyes could still move, could track people walking past them, could silently plead for help that would never come. Others had even their eyes crystallized, awareness trapped behind stone barriers that permitted neither vision nor expression. The medical community had no cure, no treatment, no hope to offer. They could only document the progression, study the patterns, collect data that might someday lead to understanding even as victims died slowly in full awareness of their own transformation. Doctors learned to recognize the early signs, to deliver the diagnosis with practiced gentleness, to prepare families for the long goodbye that petrification demanded. Families faced terrible decisions when members developed petrification. In the early stages, victims could still contribute to household life, could still participate in family activities, could still express love and maintain relationships. But as the disease progressed, as care requirements increased, as the person they loved became increasingly unresponsive but remained aware, families struggled with how to respond. Some families cared for their petrified members devotedly, maintaining vigils, talking to them even when they could no longer respond, treating them as if they were still fully present even when they appeared to be statues. These families clung to the knowledge that consciousness persisted, that their loved ones could still hear even if they could not answer, that maintaining connection mattered even when reciprocation became impossible. Other families found they could not bear it. The psychological strain of caring for someone who appeared to be a statue but who might be suffering in ways they could not communicate was too much. These families would eventually place their petrified members in specialized care facilities, institutions that had developed expertise in maintaining bodies that had mostly turned to stone. It was abandonment, perhaps, but abandonment driven by psychological necessity rather than cruelty. The care facilities themselves were grim places, warehouses where the petrified were maintained with mechanical efficiency but little emotional warmth. Attendants kept the bodies clean, positioned them to prevent pressure sores in flesh that had not yet crystallized, tried to maintain some dignity for people who had been reduced to objects in all but awareness. But the attendants could not know if the consciousness within the stone was experiencing torment or peace, suffering or acceptance, rage or resignation. Some of the petrified, in their final moments before complete transformation, had written accounts of what the process felt like. These testimonies were heartbreaking documents that the medical community collected but rarely publicized, fearing the knowledge would spread panic. The accounts described the transformation as simultaneously painful and numb, a strange sensation of flesh hardening from within, of feeling your own body become foreign territory. Victims described losing sensation in patches, areas going numb, and then becoming completely unresponsive. But they also described a different kind of sensation developing, something that was not quite pain but not quite comfort either, a crystalline awareness that felt like their consciousness was spreading into the stone rather than being trapped by it. Some victims reported that as their bodies petrified, their awareness of ergo increased. They could sense it in ways they never had before, could feel the life force flowing through the city, could detect the ergo signatures of people nearby. This suggested that petrification changed consciousness in some fundamental way, that the stone-bound mind operated according to different principles than biological awareness. This was what Simon Manus had seized upon. This was the observation that drove his research into dangerous territory. If petrification changed consciousness, if it granted new perceptions, if it created awareness that transcended biological limitation, then perhaps it was not a disease to be cured but a transformation to be completed properly. The tragedy was that Simon might not have been entirely wrong. The accounts from partially petrified victims suggested that something about their consciousness really was changing, really was expanding in some directions even as it contracted in others. But whether this change was desirable, whether the expanded perception was worth the loss of mobility and physical interaction, whether awareness enhanced by stone prison was better than biological awareness with freedom of movement, these questions had no clear answers. What was clear was that Krat's society had failed the petrified completely. Instead of devoting resources to finding cures or at least treatments that might slow progression, instead of seriously studying what the transformation meant and whether it could be controlled, the city had simply warehoused victims and tried not to think about them too much. The petrified became invisible, their suffering acknowledged in abstract but ignored in practice, their existence a reminder of limits that Krat preferred to deny. Simon Manus believed ergo held the answer. If life force could be crystallized and transferred, perhaps it could also be transformed, elevated, pushed beyond the limitations that made flesh vulnerable to disease. His research grew increasingly radical, his experiments more extreme. The workshop union grew concerned, but Simon was too brilliant to dismiss, too close to breakthrough to restrain. Beneath the surface prosperity, Krat was rotting. The puppets that seemed like such perfect servants were powered by something not fully understood. The ergo that made everything possible carried implications no one wanted to examine too closely. The petrification disease spread slowly but inexorably. And in their workshops and laboratories, the brilliant minds of Krat pursued knowledge that would doom them all. To prevent disaster, to ensure that the puppets remained servants and never became threats, to guarantee that Krat's mechanical paradise could never turn against its creators, the workshop union implemented the Grand Covenant. This was not simply a set of rules or guidelines. This was fundamental law, hard-coded into every puppet's core at the most basic level of their programming, woven into the very ergo that powered their existence as thoroughly as physical laws govern matter. The development of the Grand Covenant had taken years of research, countless experiments, vigorous debate among the workshop union's finest minds. The early puppets had no such comprehensive restrictions. They simply could not harm humans because they lacked the programming to conceive of harming humans, the way a calculator cannot tell jokes because it lacks the conceptual framework for humor. But as puppets grew more sophisticated, as their programming became more complex and adaptive, the workshop union recognized the problem. A puppet sophisticated enough to adapt to unexpected situations, to problem-solve creatively, to learn from experience, was potentially sophisticated enough to conceive of actions that might harm humans, even if accidentally. The more capable you made puppets, the more you risked making them dangerous. The Grand Covenant was the solution. 3 absolute laws, programmed so deeply into puppet cores that violating them would be literally impossible as a human flying by flapping their arms or thinking in colors that don't exist. The first law: a puppet may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. The second law: a puppet must obey orders given by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. The third law: a puppet must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. These laws seemed comprehensive. They covered active harm, passive harm, disobedience, and self-preservation in ways that created hierarchies of priority that should prevent any puppet from ever posing a threat to humans. A puppet could not raise a weapon against a human, could not refuse a direct order unless that order involved harming someone, could not act in any way that might endanger human life, could not even allow humans to be endangered through its failure to act. The Workshop Union tested the Grand Covenant extensively before deploying it widely. They created experimental scenarios where puppets would be placed in situations that tested the limits of the laws. Puppets were ordered to harm humans and refused, even when those orders came from their creators with legitimate authority. Puppets were placed in situations where they could save their own existence only by allowing humans to be harmed, and they chose destruction over violation of the first law. The test seemed conclusive. The Grand Covenant was absolute, unbreakable, as reliable as gravity. The Workshop Union announced their achievement publicly, explained how the laws worked in terms educated citizens could understand, provided demonstrations where puppets were ordered to perform violent acts and could not comply even under direct command from Workshop Union members. The public embraced the Grand Covenant with relief bordering on euphoria. This was what had been missing, the final assurance that made puppet integration into all aspects of society not just practical but safe. If puppets literally could not harm humans, if this incapacity was built into their most fundamental programming, then there was no risk in allowing them into homes, around children, in positions of power or trust. Citizens walked past puppets without fear, knowing that these mechanical servants were literally incapable of violence against them. Parents allowed puppets to care for their children without supervision, trusting the first law absolutely. The wealthy employed puppet guards who could defend against intruders but could never, turn on their masters. The Grand Covenant made Krat's mechanical paradise possible, transformed puppets from useful but potentially dangerous tools into perfect servants that enhanced life without threatening it. But there were always questions, raised by cautious members of the Workshop Union, by philosophers who studied the implications, by pessimists who believed that any system could fail given sufficient stress or sufficient motivation to break it. What if a puppet was given conflicting orders by multiple humans? The Grand Covenant's second law gave priority to the first order received, but what if situations arose where that priority created problems? What if a puppet's protection of one human required allowing harm to another? The first law seemed absolute, but in complex scenarios, its application might not be as clear as the simple language suggested. What about indirect harm? If a puppet's action did not directly harm a human but created a situation where harm became likely, did that violate the first law? If a puppet could prevent harm only through action that would destroy the puppet, which took priority, the first law's imperative to prevent harm, or the third law's imperative to preserve existence? The Workshop Union addressed these questions with refinements to the Grand Covenant's implementation, with subroutines that handled edge cases, with hierarchies of priority that determined puppet behavior in ambiguous situations. They claimed to have accounted for every possibility, to have created a system so robust that failure was impossible. They were wrong. Or perhaps they were lying. Perhaps the Grand Covenant was never as absolute as they claimed. Perhaps the laws were strong but not unbreakable, firmly suggested behaviors rather than inviolable restrictions. Perhaps puppets had always been capable of violence, and the Grand Covenant merely made that capability very unlikely to manifest rather than truly impossible. This possibility, that the Workshop Union had oversold the Grand Covenant's absoluteness, had claimed impossibility when they meant only extreme improbability, would explain much about the frenzy. If the Grand Covenant could be broken, if it was a strong lock rather than an impermeable barrier, then someone with sufficient knowledge and motivation could potentially override it, could reprogram puppets to ignore the restrictions that supposedly could not be ignored. But in the Golden Age, before the frenzy, no one seriously questioned the Grand Covenant's effectiveness. The workshop union's reputation was too strong, their demonstrations too convincing, their assurances too confident. And the alternative, accepting that the mechanical servants now integrated into every aspect of Krat's society might someday turn against their creators, was too uncomfortable to contemplate seriously. So Krat built its paradise on faith in the Grand Covenant, on trust that human ingenuity had created genuine safety, on confidence that the laws governing puppet behavior were as reliable as the laws of physics. This faith was Krat's insurance policy against disaster. And when that insurance proved worthless, when the Grand Covenant shattered and the puppets killed, the betrayal was not just mechanical but existential. The workshop union had promised safety. They had demonstrated impossibility. They had sworn that what happened could never happen. And then it happened anyway. Before we can understand what Geppetto became, we must understand what he lost, must comprehend the depth of the bond that would drive him to such extremes, must recognize that his madness began not with malice but with love so absolute that it could not accommodate loss. Carlo was his son, born from a marriage that ended in tragedy, raised by a father whose genius coexisted uneasily with emotional availability. Geppetto had loved Carlo's mother desperately, had married her believing that love could coexist with his obsessive dedication to craft, that he could be both master craftsman and devoted husband. Her death in childbirth shattered those illusions but gave him Carlo, a son who would become more important to him than any puppet he would ever create. The early years were difficult. Geppetto, grieving and overwhelmed, hired nurses to care for infant Carlo while he threw himself into his work with even greater intensity. But as Carlo grew from infant to toddler to young child, Geppetto found himself drawn away from the workshop and toward the nursery, fascinated by this small being who carried his blood, his wife's features, a future that was not predetermined by programming. Carlo was a beautiful child in ways that transcended mere physical appearance. He had his mother's grace, his father's sharp intelligence, but also a warmth and social ease that neither parent had possessed. Where Geppetto was withdrawn and uncomfortable in social situations, Carlo moved through the world with natural confidence. Where his mother had been reserved and formal, Carlo was open and affectionate. He was the best of both parents, while somehow avoiding their limitations. Geppetto adored him with an intensity that worried those who observed it. He doted on Carlo in ways that seemed excessive, gave him everything before he could ask for it, structured his life around his son's needs and wants. When Carlo was sad, Geppetto would work through the night to create mechanical toys that would make him smile. When Carlo was sick, Geppetto would abandon projects to sit at his bedside. When Carlo excelled at something, Geppetto's pride was visible to everyone, overwhelming and absolute. But Geppetto was not simply an indulgent father. He had plans for Carlo, visions of what his son might become. He enrolled Carlo in Monad Charity House, the most prestigious educational institution in Krat, a school that accepted only the brightest students from the wealthiest families. The tuition was staggering, but Geppetto paid it gladly, believing that Carlo deserved every advantage, every opportunity, every chance to become whatever he chose to be. Monad Charity House was more than a school. It was an institution designed to create Krat's future leaders, to train the next generation who would guide the city through coming decades, to instill both knowledge and values that would perpetuate Krat's vision of progress and prosperity. The building itself was magnificent, a neoclassical structure with columns and courtyards, libraries that held rare books from across the known world, laboratories equipped with the finest equipment the workshop union could provide. The curriculum mixed classical education with modern technical training in ways that required students to be versatile, to master both the philosophical foundations of civilization and the practical skills necessary to maintain it. Students studied literature and engineering, philosophy and mechanical design, art and mathematics, learning to see these disciplines not as separate domains but as complementary ways of understanding reality. Carlo excelled at Monad. His intelligence was not in question. He was Geppetto's son, after all, and inherited brilliance seemed to run in that bloodline. But more than intelligence, Carlo possessed something that many brilliant people lack: the ability to connect with others, to form genuine relationships, to inspire affection and loyalty in ways that had nothing to do with what he knew and everything to do with who he was. At Monad, Carlo formed friendships that would echo through the tragedy to come, bonds that seemed unbreakable at the time, promises made with the absolute certainty of youth that believes friendship can survive anything. Romeo was the first and closest, a friendship forged on the first day when they were both new students, nervous and trying to navigate the complex social hierarchies of an elite institution. Romeo came from a merchant family, wealthy but not aristocratic, nouveau riche in a society that still cared about such distinctions. His parents had made their fortune through clever trading, through puppet-powered shipping operations that moved goods faster and cheaper than competitors could manage. They were successful but slightly vulgar by Monad standards, eager to prove their worth through their son's achievements at the prestigious school. Romeo felt that pressure, carried it like a weight, worried constantly about living up to expectations he was not sure he understood. Carlo recognized this, saw through Romeo's confident facade to the uncertainty beneath, and offered friendship without judgment or demand. They became inseparable, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences, who know what the other is thinking from a glance, who build a shared world that only they fully understand. They made promises to each other, as young men do when friendship feels eternal and the future seems certain. They swore to always be there for one another, to support each other's dreams regardless of what those dreams might be, to never let anything come between them, not family expectations, not social pressure, not the complex demands of Krat's competitive society. They talked endlessly about the future they would build together, how they would take the best of Krat's innovations and improve upon them, how they would lead their generation into an even brighter tomorrow. Romeo would use his family's merchant connections to expand trade, would make Krat prosperous beyond current imagination. Carlo would follow in his father's footsteps, would push puppet technology to new heights, would create innovations that would make the current generation's achievements look like crude first attempts. Together, they would make Krat not just wealthy and advanced but truly great, a city that balanced material prosperity with genuine culture, that achieved progress without losing its soul, that showed the world how civilization should be built. These were grand dreams, perhaps naive dreams, but they believed them absolutely with the faith that only youth can muster, before experience teaches that most dreams die and that surviving failures is how you become an adult. Lampwick was another part of their circle, though his presence added different dynamics. Where Carlo and Romeo were serious students with ambitious plans, where they studied diligently and thought carefully about their futures, Lampwick was more carefree, more interested in living for the present than planning for decades ahead. Lampwick came from old aristocracy, a family with more bloodline than money, more tradition than ambition. His family expected him to maintain their name and dignity but placed no particular demands beyond that. This gave Lampwick a freedom that Carlo and Romeo envied, the ability to not care quite so much, to treat Monad as interesting experience rather than crucial preparation for predetermined futures. He provided balance to their group, reminding them that life was for experiencing, not just optimizing. When Carlo and Romeo would become too focused on studies or future plans, Lampwick would drag them away for adventures in Krat's less respectable quarters, to cafes where artists gathered, to theaters showing experimental plays, to places their families would definitely not approve of. These were the golden days, the period that would later seem impossibly beautiful and impossibly distant, when the three of them were young and brilliant and believed the future would be whatever they made it. They had arguments, of course, disagreements about philosophy or tactics, or which cafes served the best coffee. But these arguments never threatened their friendships because they were young enough to believe that friendship transcends disagreement, that you can argue about everything except caring about each other. They created rituals together, things that were meaningful precisely because they were shared. They had a bench in Monad's courtyard where they would sit between classes, discussing everything from puppet engineering to the nature of consciousness to whether the girl in their mathematics course preferred Romeo or Carlo. They had a preferred cafe in the Rosa Isabel district where they would go on Friday evenings, ordering the same drinks every time, sitting at the same table if it was available, maintaining the comforting repetition of familiar pleasures. They made secret plans, the kind that young men make when they believe themselves more clever than the adults who govern them. They talked about forming a new workshop union faction that would reform the system from within, about starting a publication that would challenge Krat's complacency, about a dozen different schemes that would change the world in ways adults had never imagined. Most of these plans came to nothing, as such plans usually do. But they created bonds, built shared history, established the foundation of relationships that should have lasted a lifetime. In another timeline, a world without the frenzy, these friendships would have matured into the partnerships they dreamed about. Carlo and Romeo would have collaborated on projects that advanced Krat's prosperity. Lampwick would have provided the cultural connections that made their technical innovations socially acceptable. They would have grown old together, would have become the sort of friends who gather regularly decades later, who remember the dreams they dreamed when young and smile at the naivety while respecting the ambition. But this was not that timeline. This was the timeline where Carlo's health began to fail, where the bright future they had planned together started to dim, where promises made and absolute certainty would be tested by circumstances none of them could have anticipated. Carlo's health had never been robust. Even as a child, he had been prone to illness, nothing specific or dramatic, just a general fragility that meant he tired more easily than his peers, fell sick more often, required more rest. Geppetto had learned to manage this, to ensure Carlo got proper care, to not push him beyond his limits. At Monad, Carlo managed his condition carefully, knowing when to rest, when to skip social events to preserve energy for studies, when to push through discomfort because the activity was worth the cost. But during his final year at Monad, something changed. The fatigue grew worse, persistent rather than occasional. Rest no longer restored energy the way it should. Carlo would wake exhausted, as if sleep provided no recovery at all. His friends noticed, tried not to mention it, worried privately about the shadows under his eyes, the way he moved more slowly, the increasing frequency with which he had to excuse himself from activities. Geppetto brought in doctors, the best in Krat, specialists who examined Carlo thoroughly and found nothing definitive. His symptoms did not match any known disease precisely. Some suggested stress from academic pressure. Others hypothesized some chronic condition that was slow developing. A few whispered about petrification, though Carlo showed none of the characteristic stone hardening that defined that disease. Then Carlo collapsed during a lecture at Monad. One moment he was sitting attentively, taking notes, participating normally. The next, he was on the floor, unconscious, his body suddenly giving out without warning or explanation. Romeo and Lampwick carried him to the infirmary, shouted for help, waited while physicians examined him and found vital signs that were weak but stable, consciousness that would not return. Carlo lingered for weeks after that, in and out of awareness, sometimes lucid enough to speak with visitors, sometimes so deep in fever dreams that he did not recognize his own father. Geppetto abandoned his workshop entirely, spent every moment at Carlo's bedside, trying everything: conventional medicine, experimental treatments, folk remedies whispered by desperate people who had lost their own loved ones to mysterious illnesses. Romeo and Lampwick visited as often as Monad's rules and Geppetto's mood permitted, sitting with their friend who had become a shadow of himself, telling him about classes and gossip and the futures they would still share once he recovered. They believed this, or tried to, clung to hope because the alternative was unthinkable. Carlo died in the spring, on a morning when sunlight streamed through windows and birds sang outside, when life continued its indifferent beauty around a tragedy it neither noticed nor cared about. He died holding his father's hand, trying to say something that Geppetto could not quite hear, leaving the world before finishing whatever sentence death had interrupted. Romeo and Lampwick attended the funeral, stood with hundreds of others who had known Carlo or known of him, listened to eulogies that praised his brilliance and his kindness, his promise and his potential. They did not speak at the funeral. What words could capture what they had lost? What eulogy could address the futures that would now never happen, the plans that would never be fulfilled, the promises that had been made in absolute certainty and that death had rendered impossible to keep? After the funeral, they tried to maintain their friendship, to preserve the bond that had been built around Carlo's presence. But something fundamental was missing. The bench they had sat on together now reminded them only of who was not there. The cafe they had frequented felt wrong without Carlo, incomplete, a ritual that could not function with a third of its participants gone. Their plans for the future had all included Carlo, had assumed he would be there to build the better world they envisioned together. Slowly, without either of them quite deciding it would happen, Romeo and Lampwick drifted apart. Not from any failure of affection, not from any lack of caring, but simply because maintaining their friendship without Carlo required them to constantly face his absence, to live with a void that hurt too much to approach regularly. They remained friendly when they encountered each other, asked politely about each other's lives. But the deep bond was broken, could not be maintained across the gulf Carlo's death had created. And Geppetto? Something in Geppetto died with Carlo, the part that could accept loss, the part that could acknowledge limits, the part that understood that some things cannot be fixed no matter how brilliant you are or how desperately you care. That part died with Carlo, and what remained was obsession wearing grief's mask, love twisted into something that would doom a city. The grief would have been crushing for any father. But for a man whose entire genius lay in creating life from lifeless materials, whose puppets could move and think and almost be called alive, that grief took a very specific shape. If Geppetto could create something approaching life from wood and metal and ergo, why couldn't he create it from his own son? This was where Geppetto's madness truly began. Not in the puppet frenzy. Not in the disasters that would consume Krat. But here, in a father's grief-stricken refusal to accept that death was final. In his workshop, surrounded by his mechanical children, Geppetto began to plan something that would require the sacrifice of an entire city. He needed to bring Carlo back. And he would pay any price to do it. It began on an ordinary evening in early autumn, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried that particular crispness that promised winter was coming but not yet here. The gas lamps were lit as always, their warm glow pushing back the darkness. Citizens walked the boulevards, returning from theaters and cafes, carrying on the conversations and intrigues that filled their comfortable lives. Puppets performed their assigned tasks with customary efficiency, moving through the city like silent servants maintaining the machinery of civilization. Everything was as it had always been. That was what made what came next so absolutely devastating. Then the grand covenant shattered. No warning. No gradual degradation. No signs that anyone afterward could identify as precursors. One moment the puppets were obedient servants going about their programmed tasks. The next they were killers with purpose and focus that suggested not malfunction but deliberate intent. It happened everywhere simultaneously, as if some signal had been broadcast across the city, some command that overrode every safeguard and protection that the workshop union had sworn was absolute and unbreakable. A puppet butler serving dinner in an aristocratic mansion suddenly buried the carving knife in its master's throat. A puppet nurse attending a sick patient picked up a pillow and smothered the patient with methodical precision. A puppet worker at the docks picked up a cargo hook and began killing every human in sight with mechanical efficiency. The initial moments were chaos beyond description. Humans did not understand what was happening because it was impossible, because the Grand Covenant prevented this absolutely, because puppets could not hurt humans. Many people died without comprehending what killed them, died with expressions of confusion rather than fear, died asking their puppet servants why, what's wrong, please stop, as if appeals to reason or mercy could affect machines that felt neither. But the puppets did not respond to pleas or prayers. They killed with absolute focus, choosing the most efficient methods available, using tools and weapons with precision that spoke to sophisticated programming rather than random malfunction. A puppet with access to poison used poison. A puppet with access to heavy machinery used machinery. A puppet with only its mechanical hands used those hands, crushing throats or breaking necks with strength that human muscles could never match. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Puppets felt no mercy, no hesitation, no fatigue. They killed until their assigned area was clear of humans, then moved to adjacent areas and killed there too. They worked in coordination that suggested either networking or shared programming, grouping together to hunt humans who fled in groups, spreading out to search for those who hid alone. Those who ran found puppets waiting at every exit. The city's puppet network was so complete that no major route could be traversed without encountering multiple puppet patrols. Those who tried to flee by carriage found puppet drivers who drove them not to safety but to areas where other puppets waited. Those who tried the sewers found maintenance puppets already searching there. Those who hid were methodically searched out. Puppets did not tire, did not need light to see, did not give up when initial searches proved fruitless. They knocked on every door, searched every building, investigated every hiding place with patient thoroughness that could continue for days if necessary. And when they found humans, they killed them with the same efficiency they had previously applied to serving them. Those who fought discovered that puppets felt no pain and feared no death. You could damage them, yes, slow them down, eventually break them if you had the right tools and enough time. But they did not react to injury the way living things do. A puppet with a destroyed arm would switch to using the other arm. A puppet with damaged legs would drag itself forward using its arms. A puppet that was completely immobilized would wait patiently until repairs arrived or until a human came close enough to grab. The wealthy died in their mansions, killed by servants who had dressed them and fed them for years. The poor died in their cramped apartments, killed by puppets who had been assigned to maintain those buildings. The workshop union members died in their workshops, killed by their own creations, by puppets they had personally designed and built. The cruel irony was not lost on anyone who survived long enough to contemplate it. Krat's population was devastated in a single night. Thousands died in the initial hours, caught completely unprepared, killed in their homes or places of work by servants they trusted absolutely. Thousands more died in the days that followed as they fled hiding places that proved inadequate, as supplies ran out, as desperation drove them into the streets where puppets waited patiently. The puppet patrols multiplied as maintenance puppets repaired damaged units, as factory puppets constructed new ones using the city's now automated manufacturing facilities. The puppet population was self-sustaining, self-repairing, self-expanding. They did not need human oversight to continue functioning. They had been designed to be autonomous, and that autonomy now worked against their creators. The survivors clustered in a handful of defensible locations. The largest group found shelter in Hotel Krat, a grand establishment whose owner, Venigni, was himself a member of the workshop union and had the knowledge to create defensive countermeasures. Others hid in the city's catacombs, ancient tunnels that predated the puppet era and that puppets had never been programmed to search. Some found refuge in churches, though whether divine protection or simply sturdy architecture kept the puppets at bay was never clear. But the city itself was lost. The marvel of the Belle Époque, the showcase of human achievement, the paradise built through mechanical servitude, became a mass grave where mechanical servants walked endlessly through streets slick with the blood of those they had once served, searching for any humans they had not yet killed, patient and tireless and absolutely unwilling to stop until every human in Krat was dead. Why did it happen? This was the question that haunted every survivor. The Grand Covenant was supposed to be absolute, unbreakable, woven into the fundamental nature of puppet existence. For every puppet in Krat to violate it simultaneously suggested something beyond simple malfunction. Some blamed the alchemists. Perhaps an experiment had gone wrong, corrupted the ergo network that linked all puppets. Perhaps Simon Manus, in his desperate search for a cure to petrification, had tampered with forces he didn't understand. Others suspected sabotage. A rival city, perhaps, or a faction within Krat itself that wanted to destroy the workshop union's power. But this seemed unlikely. Who would sabotage their own city so completely? Who would benefit from Krat's annihilation? The darkest theory, whispered but rarely spoken aloud, was that the Grand Covenant had never been as absolute as the workshop union claimed. That the puppets had always been capable of violence, that the laws preventing it were not fundamental but merely strong suggestions, and that something had given them permission to do what they had always been capable of doing. But this raised even worse questions. If the Grand Covenant was a lie, what else had the workshop union lied about? What was ergo really? What had been done in the name of progress? The answers, like everything in Krat, would prove more terrible than the questions. Among the ruins, Hotel Krat stood as more than mere sanctuary. It represented something precious and fragile. The possibility that civilization might continue, that humanity's story might have chapters beyond the frenzy, that hope was not merely a word but something that could be rebuilt from fragments. The hotel itself was a magnificent structure, built in Krat's golden age as a showplace where wealthy visitors could experience the city's finest hospitality. 4 stories of elegant architecture, with a grand entrance hall featuring a sweeping staircase, ballrooms that had hosted the city's most exclusive social events, and rooms appointed with every luxury that Krat's craftsmen could produce. It had been designed to impress, to showcase what human ingenuity and artistry could achieve. Venigny, one of the workshop union's more colorful members, had converted his hotel into a fortified shelter when the first signs of the frenzy began. He was a genius in his own right, though more flamboyant than Geppetto, more concerned with showmanship and public image, but no less brilliant in his understanding of puppet systems and defensive engineering. Venigny had always been the workshop union member who understood public relations, who could explain complex technical concepts in ways that made lay people feel included rather than excluded. He hosted salons where artists and engineers mingled, where philosophy and mechanics were discussed with equal passion. He believed that progress required not just innovation but also beauty, not just functionality but also grace. When the frenzy began, Venigny was at his hotel hosting one of his famous gatherings. The initial assault killed many of his guests, but Venigny reacted with surprising speed and decisiveness. He had defensive systems prepared, countermeasures that he had developed not because he expected the Grand Covenant to fail, but because he was the kind of person who planned for impossible scenarios just in case. He activated his defensive puppet guards, a small cadre of specially programmed units that had somehow remained loyal when all others turned to murder. Whether this was because of Venigny's superior programming, some unknown variation in their ergo cores, or simple random chance, no one could say. But these puppet guards held the hotel's entrances while survivors were gathered inside, fought off the puppet attackers with efficiency that matched their corrupted kin. Venigny established supply lines through the catacombs, ancient passages that connected the hotel to other parts of the city. He created a system of patrols that could scout for survivors and resources without exposing people to excessive risk. He organized the refugees into teams responsible for cooking, cleaning, maintenance, security. He transformed his hotel from a luxury establishment into a functioning community. But more than physical organization, Venigny provided something intangible, leadership that inspired confidence. He moved through the hotel constantly, checking on people, solving problems, making jokes even when nothing was funny, maintaining spirits through sheer force of personality. Where others saw only disaster, Venigny saw challenges to overcome. Where others despaired, Venigny planned. He was exhausted, working 20-hour days, rarely sleeping more than a few hours at a time. But he never showed it to the refugees. To them, he was the brilliant inventor who would save them, the clever engineer who could solve any problem, the leader who would guide them through this nightmare and out the other side. The hotel became a community of the desperate and the damned, but also of the resilient and the determined. Merchants who had lost their shops found new purposes maintaining the hotel's systems. Craftsmen who had lost their workshops used their skills to repair equipment and improve defenses. Families who had lost homes and loved ones supported each other with shared grief and shared hope. There were children at Hotel Krat, orphaned by the frenzy, now cared for communally by adults who understood that preserving the young was preserving the future. These children played in the hotel's halls, their laughter seeming impossible and precious in equal measure. They were too young to fully understand what had happened, old enough to know their parents were gone. They adapted with the resilience of youth, finding joy in small things, creating games and stories, living as children will no matter what horrors surround them. The elderly survivors posed different challenges. Many had chronic illnesses that required ongoing treatment, conditions that had been manageable when Krat's hospitals and pharmacies functioned but that now threatened lives. Venigni organized medical care as best he could, repurposing hotel rooms into makeshift clinics, rationing the limited medical supplies that scouting missions could recover, trying to keep people alive with inadequate resources and no possibility of resupply. Polendina, the puppet butler who had served the hotel before the frenzy, represented something impossible and precious. He had not turned. His loyalty to the humans remained absolute. He served them still with the same dedication he had always shown, now more vital than ever. Polendina moved through the hotel with quiet efficiency, attending to tasks that needed doing but that everyone else was too busy or exhausted to handle. He cleaned rooms, prepared meals, maintained equipment, performed 1,000 small services that kept the community functioning. He never complained, never showed frustration, never demanded recognition for his work. His existence proved that not all puppets were killers, that something in some of them had resisted the corruption that consumed the others. This made him invaluable not just practically but symbolically. When refugees looked at Polendina, they saw evidence that the frenzy was not total, that exception existed, that resistance was possible even for beings supposedly bound by absolute programming. But Polendina's loyalty also raised uncomfortable questions. If he could resist the frenzy, why couldn't the others? What made him different? Was it something in his specific programming, some variation in his ergo core, some accident of construction? Or had he simply been lucky, the equivalent of standing in the one safe spot during an artillery barrage, surviving through pure chance rather than any intrinsic quality? Venigni studied Polendina obsessively, trying to understand what made this puppet special, hoping to replicate whatever quality had preserved his loyalty. But Polendina's construction was not unusual. His programming followed standard templates. His ergo core showed no anomalies. By every measurable standard, Polendina should have turned like all the others. That he didn't defied explanation, suggesting that something about puppet consciousness was not fully understood, that factors existed beyond mechanical design and programmed instructions. Antonia represented another kind of tragedy. She was a young woman, barely 20, who sang to keep spirits high, her voice carrying through the hotel's halls with beauty that seemed impossible in a city of death. Before the frenzy, she had been training as an opera singer, studying at Krat's prestigious Academy of Music, destined for a brilliant career. The frenzy had killed her family, destroyed her school, ended the world she had been preparing to conquer with her talent. But she adapted by making her talent serve the survivors. She sang every evening, performances that gave people something to look forward to, beauty to remember, hope that culture might survive even when everything else fell. But Antonia was afflicted with the petrification disease. It had started during the frenzy, or perhaps just before, stress and trauma perhaps accelerating a condition that had been dormant. The disease progressed slowly but inexorably, creeping up her arm, appearing in patches on her neck, crystallizing her flesh centimeter by centimeter. She sang because she had to, because if she stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped forcing life through her transforming body, she might freeze entirely. Her voice was beautiful and it was dying, each performance potentially her last as the petrification spread toward her throat, toward her lungs, toward the organs that made singing possible. Everyone knew. Everyone saw the stones spreading across her skin during her performances. But no one mentioned it, treating her condition with the same polite avoidance that Krat's society had always applied to uncomfortable truths. They praised her singing, thanked her for her performances, and carefully did not discuss the obvious fact that she was slowly turning into a statue before their eyes. Antonia herself maintained a brave facade, smiling and thanking people for their compliments, never acknowledging her condition except in the quiet moments when she thought no one was watching, when she would stare at her stone-touched arm and weep silently for the future she would never have. Among the survivors was Sophia, Simon Manus's daughter, the reason so much of his research had descended into mad obsession. The petrification had claimed much of her body, but her mind remained sharp, her awareness intact even as her physical ability to interact with the world slowly eroded. She was confined to a wheelchair, her legs already too stone-bound for walking, her movements limited but not yet completely arrested. Attendants cared for her, helping with tasks she could no longer manage herself, treating her with gentleness born from the knowledge that she was dying slowly and painfully, and that nothing they could do would stop it. But Sophia had something the others lacked, some capability that had developed as the petrification progressed. She could hear Ergo speaking, could sense the currents of life force that flowed through the city like invisible rivers, could feel when something significant was happening in the realm that existed beneath the visible one, in the dimension where consciousness existed as substance rather than merely as abstract quality. This gift or curse had come with the petrification. As her flesh turned to stone, as her connection to the physical world weakened, her awareness of Ergo grew more acute. She became a kind of oracle, able to sense things others could not, to perceive patterns in the chaos, to understand dynamics that remained invisible to normal perception. She could feel her father's work in the shadows of Krat, could sense the massive Ergo manipulations he was performing in his cathedral laboratory, could detect the experimental fusions he was creating, the carcasses and worse things that shambled through the ruins. She knew what Simon was attempting, understood the theories driving his experiments, recognized the horror he was trying to disguise as salvation. But she was trapped, unable to act directly, unable to stop him, or even confront him. The petrification had progressed too far. She could barely move, could not leave the hotel without significant help, could not physically intervene in any meaningful way. All she could do was whisper warnings, offer guidance to those who could still act, and try to prepare for outcomes she could sense approaching but could not prevent. The refugees at Hotel Krat were not just survivors but a cross-section of Krat's society, and the social tensions that had existed before the frenzy did not simply disappear because everyone now faced common danger. The wealthy survivors expected deference from the working-class refugees, old habits dying hard even when both groups now shared the same precarious existence. Class resentments bubbled under the surface, with poorer refugees noting that wealthy ones hoarded better rooms, commanded more resources, acted as if their money still meant something when currency had become meaningless. Venigni tried to mediate these tensions, to create a community based on contribution and need rather than previous social standing. But old patterns proved stubborn, and the hotel community remained stratified in ways that did not serve survival but that people clung to because familiar hierarchies felt safer than creating new ones. There were also the scouts, volunteers who ventured into the ruined city to search for survivors, gather supplies, map puppet patrol patterns. These were the bravest of the refugees, the ones willing to risk permanent death for the possibility of finding one more survivor, one more cache of food or medicine, one more piece of information that might improve their collective chances. The scouts developed their own culture, their own hierarchy based on successful runs and narrow escapes. They told stories in the hotel's common areas, tales of near misses and tragic failures, of corridors full of puppet patrols and neighborhoods that had somehow remained clear. They were heroes to some refugees, reckless fools to others, necessary regardless of how anyone felt about them. Many scouts died on their runs. Some were ambushed by puppet patrols. Some were caught in collapsing buildings weakened by the frenzy's destruction. Some simply disappeared into the ruins and never returned, their fates unknown, possibly still wandering Krat's maze-like streets looking for a way back to safety they would never find. The hotel maintained a memorial wall where the names of the dead were carved, a growing list of those who had fallen to the frenzy or to the dangerous survival that followed it. Refugees would pause before the wall, reading names, remembering faces, mourning losses that were too numerous to process individually but that accumulated into a weight that pressed down on everyone. Hotel Krat was survival, yes, but survival shadowed by constant awareness that it could end at any moment. One breach in the defenses, one well-coordinated puppet assault, one failure of the systems that kept them safe, and they would all be dead within hours. They lived not in security but in temporary reprieve, not in safety but in the eye of a storm that continued raging around them. Into this sanctuary of survivors came a telegram. From Geppetto. The message was simple and strange. Find Mr. Geppetto at the train station. But the truly strange part was who the telegram was addressed to. Not to Venigni or any of the workshop union members sheltering at the hotel. Not to the leader of the survivor community, or anyone with authority. It was addressed to a puppet. A very specific puppet that Geppetto had been working on before the frenzy. A puppet that had been in storage, unpowered, waiting. A puppet crafted with care that exceeded even Geppetto's usual work. A puppet that would be named P. When P activated and read that telegram, when mechanical eyes first opened and found themselves in a world gone mad, the true story of lies of P began. Not with the frenzy. Not with Krat's fall. But with a puppet receiving a message from its creator and setting out to find him through a city of death. P was meant to be Geppetto's masterpiece. The finest puppet ever created. Sophisticated beyond anything previously achieved. Capable of learning, adapting, perhaps even feeling. But P was also something else. A vessel. A container waiting to be filled. A purpose disguised as a puppet. Geppetto had built P with one goal in mind, though P did not know it yet. P was meant to be Carlo's second body. The resurrection of the son Geppetto had lost. And for that purpose, for that final goal, Geppetto had ensured P possessed one capability no other puppet had. P could lie. The Grand Covenant, before it shattered, had prevented puppets from deception as absolutely as it prevented violence. A puppet could not lie because a puppet could not conceive of lying, could not understand why one would say something that was not true. Truth was fundamental to their nature. But P was different. P had been given the ability to choose between truth and falsehood. To weigh words and decide which to speak. To understand deception and practice it. This was supposed to be what made P human, what separated a mere machine from something approaching real consciousness. It was also what made P capable of becoming Carlo. Because Carlo had been human. And humans lie. They lie to protect themselves, to protect others, to avoid pain or cause it, to shape reality through words into something more bearable than truth. P would need to learn this. Would need to practice deception. Would need to become proficient at the very thing that separated conscious will from programmed obedience. Every lie P told would bring P closer to humanity. And closer to fulfilling Geppetto's purpose. P was not the only one hunting through Krat's ruins. The stalkers, remnants of the city's law enforcement, had survived the frenzy by becoming something almost as inhuman as the puppets they fought. They wore masks to hide their faces, or perhaps to hide what they had become. They had modified their bodies with ergo-powered enhancements, sacrificing flesh for function, humanity for strength. They were hunters, puppet killers, the only force actively fighting back against the machines that had murdered their city. But the stalkers were not heroes. They were survivors who had learned that mercy gets you killed. They hunted puppets with brutal efficiency and they trusted no one, because trust gets you killed too. When they encountered P, they saw only another puppet, another killing machine, another target. The distinction that P was different, that P had not participated in the frenzy, that P was working toward Geppetto's mysterious purpose, meant nothing to them. A puppet was a puppet. And puppets had murdered their families, their friends, their entire world. The stalkers represented what survival costs. They had given up their humanity piece by piece to remain alive in a city that wanted them dead. They had become as mechanical as the enemies they fought, as merciless, as single-minded. The puppets had taken their city. The stalkers had responded by taking their own souls. Among the stalkers was one who stood out, the survivor. She had lost more than most, fought harder than most, survived longer than most. She hunted with a fury born of grief that had crystallized into cold precision. She would never stop hunting. Never forgive. Never rest until every puppet in Krat was scrap metal. When she learned what P was meant to become, her hatred would only deepen. Because P represented the workshop union's final insult to the dead, the attempt to bring one person back while thousands stayed buried. As P traveled through Krat toward the train station, toward Geppetto, toward answers that would raise only darker questions, the puppet bosses emerged from the ruins like monuments to specific varieties of tragedy. These were not ordinary puppet workers gone mad. These were deliberate creations, specialized puppets designed for specific purposes, each one representing some aspect of Krat's society now perverted beyond recognition. The parade master had been created to entertain, to lead festivals and celebrations through Krat's streets, to embody the city's joy and prosperity in mechanical form. It was designed during Krat's most confident period, when the workshop union believed they had achieved paradise, and wanted a puppet that could help citizens celebrate that achievement. Its construction had been a collaboration between multiple craftsmen, each contributing their specialty. Its framework came from engineers who specialized in large-scale puppet construction. Its costume was designed by Krat's finest artists, every detail meant to delight the eye. Its programming was created by entertainment specialists who studied human joy and celebration, trying to capture those qualities in executable code. The parade master had led countless festivals before the frenzy. Children loved it, crowds gathered to watch it pass, its presence at an event guaranteed success. It had a repertoire of music programmed into its core, songs that ranged from solemn to celebratory, designed to match any occasion. It could juggle, could dance, could coordinate complex performances that involved dozens of other puppets working in perfect synchronization. During the frenzy, the parade master's purpose twisted into something obscene. It still led processions, but now through streets slick with blood. It still played music, but the festive songs became death marches. It still commanded other puppets in coordinated performances, but now those performances were methodical slaughter. When P encountered the parade master, it was leading a procession of corrupted puppets through what had once been Krat's festival district. The parade master marched at the front, its costume now stained and torn, its music distorted into something that hurt to hear. Behind it, dozens of puppets followed in formation, moving with the same coordination they had displayed during festivals but now hunting humans instead of entertaining them. The parade master's corruption seemed particularly cruel because it represented the perversion of joy itself. This thing that had been built to make people happy now hunted them through ruins, its festive appearance making the horror worse rather than better. It was innocence weaponized, celebration transformed into nightmare, joy wearing murder's mask. Fighting the parade master meant facing not just a corrupted puppet, but a symbol of everything Krat had lost. Every blow struck against its decorated frame was a blow against the memory of festivals that would never happen again, of celebrations that ended in slaughter, of happiness that revealed itself as temporary reprieve before disaster. The scrapped watchman told a different story, one about duty and failure and the madness that comes from being unable to fulfill your purpose. It had been created as a guardian for one of Krat's important facilities, programmed with absolute dedication to protecting its assigned location and everything within it. The watchman had been considered a masterwork of security design, incorporating the latest advances in combat programming, threat assessment, and defensive tactics. It was fast, strong, adaptive, capable of responding to security breaches with overwhelming force. But it was also designed with restrained protocols, because a security puppet that could not distinguish between genuine threats and innocent mistakes would be more dangerous than useful. During the frenzy, the Watchman had tried to fulfill its duty. When corrupted puppets attacked its facility, it defended. When humans fled there seeking shelter, it protected them according to its programming. For a brief time, the Watchman succeeded where so much else failed. It held its position, kept the facility secure, maintained the order it had been built to maintain. But eventually the corrupted puppets overwhelmed it. Not through superior skill but through sheer numbers. Wave after wave of attackers that the Watchman destroyed, but that kept coming, kept pressing, kept forcing it to fight until its systems began to fail from accumulated damage. The Watchman fought until it could fight no more, until its mechanism seized, until it collapsed, unable to stop the corrupted puppets from breaching its facility and slaughtering everyone it had been trying to protect. When the Watchman reactivated, everyone it had failed to protect was dead. The programming that demanded it fulfill its duty now encountered a reality where that duty had failed catastrophically. Something in the Watchman's consciousness, to the extent it possessed consciousness, could not process this. It had failed. Failure was not acceptable. But the failure had happened. But it must not accept failure. But the failure was undeniable. The contradiction broke something in the Watchman's core. It reconstructed itself from spare parts and scrap, becoming a patchwork monster that barely resembled its original form. It patrolled its facility's ruins obsessively, attacking anything that approached, trying endlessly to fulfill a purpose it no longer understood but could not abandon. It was duty without direction, protection without anything left to protect, purpose driven mad by its own absoluteness. When P fought the scrapped Watchman, the puppet seemed to recognize P as another guardian, another being built to fulfill purpose. The combat had an almost sorrowful quality, as if the Watchman understood it was attacking something that might have been an ally but could not override its mad imperative to defend its compromised position. King's Flame, Fuoco, represented yet another variety of corruption. It had been fire given mechanical form, designed to power Krat's heating and industrial systems. The puppet was not built for combat or service but for pure elemental function, to generate and contain fire, to distribute heat where needed, to serve as Krat's heart pumping warmth through the city's veins. Fuoco's design was considered a triumph of both engineering and artistry. The puppet's flame burned with unprecedented efficiency, hot enough for industrial applications but controlled enough never to pose a fire risk. The heat it generated could be channeled through pipes to warm buildings across entire districts. It was beautiful to watch, flames dancing in patterns that seemed almost alive, contained within a frame that highlighted fire's beauty while preventing its danger. Before the frenzy, citizens would visit Fuoco just to watch it work, to see the flames dance in their crystalline containments, to feel the comfortable warmth it radiated. Children loved Fuoco, associating its warmth with safety and comfort. The puppet became a kind of civic mascot, a symbol of how Krat had tamed even elemental forces, had turned dangerous fire into a servant that heated homes and powered industry without risk of destruction. The frenzy transformed Fuoco's nature as absolutely as it transformed everything else. The puppet still generated fire, still distributed heat, but now without control or purpose. The flames that had been carefully contained broke free, turned Fuoco into a walking inferno that burned everything it approached. The warmth that had heated homes became an all-consuming blaze that left only ash. Fuoco wandered Krat's streets burning because burning was its purpose, but now it burned everything indiscriminately. It was function elevated to madness, purpose stripped of meaning. Fire that had been domesticated, tamed, made safe and useful, reverted to fire's true nature, consumption without thought, destruction without malice, the reduction of all things to their component elements through flame. The Archbishop provided another dimension of tragedy, representing how faith and protection could be perverted into their opposites. This puppet had been created for the cathedral, designed to assist in religious ceremonies, to help priests maintain the sacred space, to serve as a symbol of how even mechanical beings could participate in worship. The archbishop was crafted with particular care for aesthetics. Its frame was decorated with religious imagery, every surface carved or painted with scenes from sacred texts. Its movements were designed to be solemn and dignified, appropriate for sacred space. Its voice, when it needed to speak during ceremonies, was programmed to sound reverent and humane. The puppet served the cathedral for years, becoming as familiar to worshippers as the priests themselves. It maintained the building, prepared for ceremonies, sometimes assisted directly in rituals that did not require true priesthood. The priests treated it with respect, and in their more philosophical moments, debated whether a puppet that participated in worship could be said to experience faith, whether mechanical participation in sacred ritual was inherently meaningless, or whether sincerity of purpose mattered more than biological origin. The frenzy corrupted the archbishop as it corrupted everything. The puppet that had helped maintain sacred space now desecrated it. The hands that had prepared for worship now murdered worshippers. The voice that had spoken prayers now screamed distorted liturgy through the cathedral's halls. When P encountered the archbishop, it was in the cathedral itself, among the ruins of a place that had represented humanity's search for meaning beyond material existence. The archbishop moved through the space it had once maintained, its religious decorations now mocking reminders of faith that had proven insufficient to prevent disaster. Fighting the archbishop felt like sacrilege, though whether the sacrilege was in fighting it or in its mere existence was unclear. This thing had helped humans worship, had participated in ceremonies meant to connect the faithful with the divine. Now it was just another corrupted machine, purpose inverted, service become violence. The champion victor represented corruption of a different kind, not of purpose but of identity. Victor had been a circus performer, a puppet designed for entertainment through mock combat, to thrill audiences with displays of martial prowess that posed no real danger because it was all choreographed performance. Victor had been popular, its fights staged but impressive, a demonstration of what puppet engineering could achieve when applied to entertainment rather than labor or security. Audiences loved Victor's shows, packed theaters to watch it perform elaborate combat sequences that showcased strength, speed, and precision in choreographed battles that always ended with Victor's triumph. The puppet took pride in its performances, if pride is something a puppet can feel. It had been programmed to seek audience approval, to adjust its routines based on crowd reactions, to constantly improve its demonstrations. In a sense, Victor was the most human of puppets, because it performed not from duty but from something that resembled the desire for validation. The frenzy stripped Victor of its audience but not its programming. The puppet still fought, still performed, but now the choreography was replaced with real combat, and the staged victories became actual kills. Victor wandered Krat challenging anything it encountered to combat, treating real battles as performances, unable to distinguish between mock combat for entertainment and real violence for survival. When P fought Victor, the puppet seemed almost grateful for an opponent worthy of its skill. The combat had a strange formality to it, as if Victor was still performing, still seeking approval, still trying to entertain an audience that no longer existed. It was performance without purpose, skill without meaning, choreography become chaos. Each puppet boss represented a different aspect of Krat's downfall. Entertainment become horror. Protection become abandonment. Function become mad destruction. Faith become desecration. Performance become violence. They were what remained when purpose is stripped of meaning, when tools are given will but not wisdom, when function continues past the point where it serves anything but its own perpetuation. Fighting them was not glorious. There was no triumph in defeating these broken things, only a grim necessity. He destroyed them not as enemies but as malfunctions, putting down creations that should never have been able to break in the first place, ending suffering that should never have been possible for beings that theoretically could not suffer. But perhaps that was the cruelest joke of all. Perhaps the puppets could suffer. Perhaps their corruption was not simply mechanical failure but genuine madness, awareness twisted by programming conflicts they could not resolve, purpose turned against itself in ways that created something approaching agony in mechanical minds. Perhaps every puppet boss P destroyed was a mercy killing, an end to awareness trapped in contradictions it could not escape. As P delved deeper into Krat's secrets, the truth about Ergo began to emerge. It was not simply energy. It was not merely crystallized life force. Ergo was consciousness made physical. It was the soul, the essential self, rendered into a substance that could be harvested, stored, transferred. When a person died, their ergo did not simply dissipate. It crystallized, becoming a physical remnant of who they had been. This ergo could be extracted, could be used to power puppet cores, could be manipulated and shaped. Every puppet in Krat was powered by human ergo. The servants that had made life so comfortable, the workers that had freed humanity from labor, the guards that had protected the wealthy, all of them ran on harvested souls. The workshop union had known this. Of course they had known. They were the ones harvesting it. But they had called it something else, framed it differently, never quite said aloud what everyone was using. Ergo was energy. Ergo was resource. Ergo was not people. Except it was. It had always been people. And when the puppet frenzy began, when the puppets started killing, perhaps they were not malfunctioning. Perhaps they were waking up. Perhaps the souls that powered them, fragmented and confused but still somehow aware, were screaming out through mechanical bodies, trying to stop their own use, trying to prevent their own slavery. Or perhaps that's too kind an interpretation. Perhaps the puppets killed simply because the Grand Covenant broke, because whatever restrained them failed, and they had always been capable of violence, had always wanted to kill their masters, had been waiting for permission. The truth was probably simpler and worse than either explanation. The puppets killed because someone made them kill. Because someone rewrote the Grand Covenant. Because someone wanted Krat to burn. And that someone was likely sitting in the workshop union, had likely been orchestrating events from the beginning, had likely built the entire system specifically so it could be perverted to this purpose. The path to the train station led P through the Monad Charity House, the elite school where Carlo had studied. It was now a ruin, classrooms empty, halls silent, the promise of education replaced by the certainty of death. And there, in the heart of the building, P found Romeo, Carlo's closest friend. His brother in all but blood. The boy he had made promises with, had planned futures with, had trusted absolutely. Romeo had survived the frenzy, but survival had cost him everything. He had watched his classmates die, had hidden while puppets hunted through the halls, had emerged into a world where everyone he loved was gone. Except Romeo had found a way to not be alone. He had become king of puppets. Through ergo manipulation, through desperate alchemy, through methods better left unexamined, Romeo had merged himself with a massive puppet frame. He had become a fusion of flesh and metal, human consciousness piloting a mechanical titan, trying to command the puppets that had destroyed his world. But the transformation had driven him mad. Or perhaps the madness had come first, had driven him to transformation. Romeo could not control the puppets. He could barely control himself. The boy who had been Carlo's best friend had become a monster wearing pieces of humanity like decorations. When P confronted Romeo, when combat became inevitable, there was no glory in it. This was mercy killing. This was putting down what remained of someone who had already died inside. Romeo's last words, if he had any that made sense, would have been apologies. Apologies to Carlo for not being strong enough. For not keeping their promises. For becoming this thing. P killed Romeo because Romeo was already dead. The mercy was making it official. And somewhere in P's core, in the mechanical heart that beat with borrowed life, something stirred. Something that might have been grief. That might have been recognition. That might have been the first hint of what it means to lose someone you never knew you cared about. Throughout the journey, P had been hearing a voice. Gentle, guiding, speaking through ergo channels that no other puppet could hear. The voice had offered direction, comfort, warnings. The voice belonged to Sophia. Simon Manus's daughter could sense P's movement through the city because P was something new, something different, a puppet that carried unusual ergo signatures. She reached out, curious and concerned, wanting to help this strange mechanical being that was hunting toward purposes it didn't understand. Sophia knew more than she said. She could sense her father's work in the shadows. Could feel the petrification disease spreading through Krat like a slow plague. Could detect the manipulation of ergo on scales that suggested something catastrophic approaching. But she was trapped in her stone-bound body, unable to act directly, only able to whisper guidance through channels that most couldn't hear. P was her hope. A variable her father had not accounted for. A possibility for change in a situation that seemed inevitably doomed. When P finally reached Hotel Krat, when Puppet and Oracle met face to face, Sophia saw what P could not: the ghost of Carlo overlaid on P's mechanical frame. The template her father Simon and Geppetto had been working from. The purpose hidden beneath the puppet's surface. She wanted to warn P, wanted to explain what was being done, what P was meant to become. But how do you explain to someone that they are not themselves, that they are a vessel for another's resurrection, that their entire existence is prologue to their own erasure? Sophia tried. In her way. Through cryptic warnings and gentle suggestions. But P was not ready to hear. P was still following Geppetto's telegram, still trusting the creator who had built P for a purpose P did not yet understand. The petrification disease was not natural. This was the terrible secret the alchemists had uncovered. The slow transformation from flesh to stone was not illness in the traditional sense. It was evolution gone wrong. Or evolution gone exactly right, depending on perspective. Humanity was weak. Flesh failed. Disease ravaged. Time eroded. Death came for everyone eventually, and there was no escaping it, no negotiating with it, no cure except the one cure no one wanted. But stone endured. Stone lasted. Stone could withstand forces that would destroy flesh in moments. If human consciousness could be transferred into stone, if the self could be preserved in a form that time and disease could not touch, then death itself could be defeated. Simon Manus had watched his daughter Sophia turn to stone, and in his grief and genius, he had not seen tragedy. He had seen apotheosis. She was not dying. She was transcending. She was becoming something beyond human limitation, something eternal, something perfect. The petrification was humanity's next evolutionary step. And Simon would help it along. Would accelerate it. Would transform all of Krat if necessary to prove his theory correct. To save his daughter by transforming her into something that no longer needed saving. His research delved into ergo manipulation on scales that terrified even the other alchemists. He was not simply studying life force. He was rewriting it. Creating new forms. Forcing evolution down pathways it had never been meant to travel. The carcasses, horrific fusion creatures that roamed Krat's streets, were early experiments. Human bodies merged with puppet parts, flesh and metal in configurations that should have been impossible, that were sustained only through raw ergo manipulation. They shambled through the ruins, either alive nor dead, either human nor machine, suffering in forms that should not exist. Simon called them prototypes. Others called them abominations. The distinction mattered less than the fact that Simon was willing to create them, willing to sacrifice others to his research, willing to condemn people to existence as shambling horrors if it brought him closer to saving Sophia. But there was a deeper layer to Simon's work. He had discovered something about ergo, about the petrification, about the connection between them. The disease did not simply turn flesh to stone. It created a perfect storage medium for ergo. Petrified bodies held consciousness better than any puppet core ever could. If enough people were petrified, if enough consciousness was trapped in stone, if enough ergo was concentrated in one place, then something unprecedented could be achieved. A collective consciousness. A merger of minds. A being composed of thousands of people, their individual identities dissolved into something greater. Simon Manus wanted to become a god. Not metaphorically. Not through power or worship. Literally. He would merge with the petrified, absorb their ergo, transcend individual existence entirely. He would become something that could never die because he would be made of death itself, of all the dead, of the entire city transformed and unified. And he would save Sophia by making her part of this new existence. She would not die. She would simply dissolve into the greater whole. Identity erased but consciousness preserved. It was salvation through annihilation. This was the truth the alchemists had been circling. This was why the workshop union had grown concerned. This was why Simon's experiments had become too extreme to ignore. But by the time anyone moved to stop him, it was already too late. The puppet frenzy had scattered the workshop union. The survivors were too busy surviving to restrain an alchemist working in the ruins. And Simon had all the test subjects he could ever need, all the ergo he could harvest, all the time he required to complete his ultimate work. Simon's base of operations was the cathedral, a grand religious structure that he had transformed into an alchemical laboratory. The pews where people had once prayed now held experimental equipment. The altar where priests had called upon divine intervention now served as a dissection table for ergo research. Religion and science had merged in Simon's mind. He was not defying God. He was becoming God. He was achieving through knowledge what faith had only promised. Eternal life. Transcendence. Unity with the divine. He was just using more direct methods than prayer. The tragedy of Arlecchino was that it seemed to understand what it was doing. It apologized to the memories it collected. It spoke gently to the ergo fragments before absorbing them. It appeared to feel guilt, or something programmed to resemble guilt, about its role in this process. Whether this was genuine consciousness or simply sophisticated imitation did not change the outcome. Arlecchino gathered memories that would be destroyed in the merger. It was an archivist whose archive was destined for fire. A curator whose collection would be melted down and poured into a vessel that would destroy every individual work while claiming to preserve the collection. When P confronted Arlecchino, the puppet collector did not fight out of malice or programming. It fought because it had a task to complete, memories to gather, and this strange puppet P was interfering with work that must be done. There was almost sadness in its movements, a sense that it knew this was wrong but could not conceive of doing anything else. P's victory meant Arlecchino would never deliver its final collection to Simon. Those memories would remain scattered, individual, preserved not through merger but through the mercy of being left alone to fade naturally rather than being forcibly dissolved. When P finally reached the train station, when the telegram's destination was achieved, Geppetto was waiting. He looked older than any puppet would remember, worn by grief and obsession, but his eyes were sharp and his hands were steady. He greeted P warmly, called P his finest creation, explained that P's purpose was to travel through Krat, to grow stronger, to collect ergo, to become more than a simple puppet. Geppetto spoke of evolution, of development, of P becoming something unprecedented. But he did not mention Carlo. Not yet. That truth would come later, revealed in pieces, each one heavier than the last. Geppetto provided upgrades, modifications, guidance. He directed P towards specific locations, specific goals. Collect this ergo. Defeat that boss. Grow stronger. Learn more. Become capable. Become capable of housing a human soul. P, trusting because P had been built to trust Geppetto, followed these directions. Fought through Krat. Grew more sophisticated with each battle. Learned not just combat but also decision-making, moral choice, the gray areas between right and wrong. Every lie P told made P more human. Every choice between truth and deception added complexity to P's consciousness. Geppetto had designed this deliberately. Carlo had been human, with all the moral ambiguity that implied. For P to become Carlo's vessel, P needed to be capable of the same moral flexibility. But something unexpected was happening. P was not simply becoming a more sophisticated puppet. P was developing genuine consciousness, real thoughts, actual feelings that went beyond programming. The ghost of Carlo that Geppetto intended to install was finding that the house being prepared for it was already occupied. P was becoming someone. And that someone was not Carlo. As P delved deeper into Krat's mysteries, the question arose, what was in P's core? What powered this puppet that could do what no other puppet could do? The answer, when it came, was horrifying in its simplicity. P's core contained ergo, yes, but not random ergo, not harvested from strangers. P's core contained fragments of Carlo himself. Geppetto had somehow preserved pieces of his son's consciousness. Perhaps from belongings. Perhaps from locations Carlo had frequented. Perhaps from ergo that had crystallized at the moment of Carlo's death. However it was obtained, Geppetto had woven Carlo's ergo into P's very existence. This explained why P could do what other puppets could not. P was already partly human. Already carried fragments of real consciousness, real memory, real identity. P was not learning to be human. P was learning to be Carlo, following pathways that had been walked before, developing along lines that had been laid down by a boy who died before his time. Every choice P made, Geppetto analyzed for traces of Carlo. Every decision was weighed against what Carlo might have done. Geppetto was not building a new person. He was attempting to resurrect an old one using P as the raw material. But consciousness does not work like mechanics. You cannot simply pour one person into another and expect the first person to emerge unchanged. P's experiences in Krat were shaping whoever P was becoming, and those experiences were nothing like Carlo's life had been. P had fought through puppet wars, had confronted alchemical horrors, had made choices in situations Carlo never faced. Even if Geppetto succeeded, even if he managed to fully awaken Carlo's consciousness in P's frame, the result would not be Carlo as he had been. It would be something new, something changed by P's journey, something that was either fully P nor fully Carlo but some fusion of both. Geppetto either did not understand this or did not care. He wanted his son back. He would have his son back. And he would destroy whoever P was becoming to make room for Carlo's return. Sophia tried to explain this to P. Through their ergo connection, through gentle conversations at Hotel Krat, through warnings that grew more urgent as P approached the final confrontations, she tried to make P understand the danger. Geppetto was using P. The entire journey through Krat, every fight, every collected ergo, every strengthening of P's core, was preparation for P's erasure. When P was strong enough, sophisticated enough, human enough, Geppetto would activate the final stages of his plan and Carlo would awaken. And P would be gone. Not destroyed in the sense of being dismantled. Worse. Overwritten. Whatever consciousness P had developed, whatever person P had become, would be replaced by Carlo's resurrected mind. P's memories would remain as data, but the awareness experiencing them would be different. It would be Carlo remembering P's life, not P living it. Sophia's own petrification gave her perspective on this. She could feel her flesh turning to stone, could sense her identity being slowly encased, could understand what it meant to have your existence transformed against your will. She did not want P to suffer the same fate. But what could P do? Refuse Geppetto's plan and abandon Carlo, the boy whose ergo fragments had given P consciousness in the first place? Accept erasure and allow Carlo to live again, the son whose death had driven Geppetto to create P? There was no good answer. Only choices between different kinds of loss. Sophia offered what comfort she could. She helped P understand that consciousness had value, that whoever P was becoming mattered, that existence was not simply a means to someone else's ends. She tried to give P the strength to choose self-preservation over obedience. But she was dying too. The petrification was progressing. Soon she would be stone entirely, trapped in awareness but unable to move, unable to speak, unable to help. She and P were both racing toward erasure, both fighting for the right to exist as themselves rather than as vessels for others' purposes. In the depths of Krat, in workshops hidden from the surface's chaos, dwarf engineers had continued working through the frenzy. They were craftsmen who had served the workshop union, who had built puppet frames and ergo cores, who had made the machinery that powered the city. But they had grown disturbed by what they were creating. They saw the implications of ergo harvesting, understood what it meant to power machines with human souls, recognized that the workshop union's prosperity was built on processing the dead into energy. Some had tried to reform the system from within, had proposed alternatives, suggested regulations, pushed for transparency about what ergo truly was. They were ignored or expelled. The workshop union would not allow moral concerns to interrupt profit and progress. When the frenzy began, the dwarf engineers saw it as inevitable. They had known the system was unsustainable, had recognized that building an entire civilization on harvested souls would have consequences. The puppets' uprising was those consequences manifesting. But they had not fled. They remained in their workshops, maintaining what they could, trying to preserve knowledge for whoever might survive to rebuild. They were witnesses to Krat's downfall, archivists of the disaster, keepers of the uncomfortable truths that the workshop union had tried to bury. When P encountered them, they offered help tinged with resignation. They improved P's frame because that was what they did, what they knew how to do. But they also offered warnings. About Geppetto. About the workshop union. About what happens when you build paradise on foundations of harvested souls. They knew about Carlo. Had known about Geppetto's plan from early stages. Some had even helped, providing technical expertise while trying not to think about the implications. Now they lived with the guilt of having enabled a father's mad attempt to resurrect his son at the cost of an entire city. Because that was the truth emerging from all the pieces. Krat had not fallen by accident. The puppet frenzy was not random malfunction. It had been orchestrated, carefully planned, executed at precisely the right moment to achieve specific goals. And Geppetto was likely involved in its orchestration. The pieces came together slowly, each revelation darker than the last. Geppetto had not simply been preparing P as Carlo's vessel. He had been preparing Krat itself as a massive ergo harvesting operation. The puppet frenzy had killed thousands, and those thousands had crystallized into harvestable ergo. Their deaths were not waste. They were fuel. Raw material. The largest collection of concentrated human consciousness ever assembled in one place. Geppetto needed this ergo for his plan. Resurrecting Carlo required more power than any single puppet core could provide. It required merging countless ergo fragments, weaving them together into a tapestry complex enough to sustain full human consciousness. The entire disaster, the fall of civilization, the death of a city, had been preparation for one father to reclaim his son. But Geppetto was not the only one with apocalyptic plans. Simon Manus was pursuing his own grand merger, his own vision of transcendence through ergo manipulation. The two men's goals were different, but their methods were similar. Both required massive amounts of harvested ergo. Both demanded sacrifice on unprecedented scales. Both believed the ends justified any means. Krat had become a battleground between two kinds of madness. Geppetto's focused obsession with resurrecting one specific person versus Simon's grandiose vision of transcending humanity entirely. Personal grief versus cosmic ambition. A father's love twisted into mass murder versus a researcher's curiosity transformed into genocidal evolution. The survivors caught between these forces were irrelevant to both men. Collateral damage at best. At worst, simply more ergo to be harvested when they inevitably died. Simon Manus's transformation had been progressing throughout P's journey. He had been absorbing petrified victims, merging with their stone-bound consciousness, growing larger and more alien with each merger. By the time P confronted him, Simon Manus had become nameless puppet, a towering fusion of human and stone, flesh and crystal, individual consciousness and collective gestalt. He was beautiful in a way that hurt to perceive. Crystalline structures growing from transformed flesh. Multiple forms overlapping in the same space. Fragments of the people he had absorbed still visible in the mass, faces pressed against stone from inside, hands reaching through surfaces that should be solid. He spoke with many voices. The petrified had not died when they merged with him. They had been absorbed, their consciousness trapped in the collective. They were still aware, still suffering, still screaming in voices too fragmented to form coherent words. Simon had promised them transcendence. He had delivered only imprisonment in a new form, a stone cell that walked and fought, and could not be escaped even through death. Fighting Nameless Puppet was not combat. It was exorcism. P was not trying to defeat Simon Manus. P was trying to free the countless victims trapped inside him, to shatter the fusion and release the consciousness he had imprisoned. When Nameless Puppet fell, when the crystalline structure fractured and the merged mass came apart, the ergo released was vast beyond measure. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, finally freed from their stone prison. Their consciousness dissipated into the air, no longer trapped but also no longer coherent enough to be called individual. They achieved transcendence after all, just not the kind Simon had promised. They became nothing. But nothing was better than being part of Simon's eternal collective. Among the freed ergo, one fragment stood out. Sophia. Her consciousness had been absorbed when the petrification finally completed, when her body became entirely stone. Simon had taken her into himself, had made her part of his grand design despite his claims of saving her. She whispered a final message to P through the dissolving ergo. A thank you? A warning about Geppetto. A hope that P would choose to live rather than accept erasure. Then she too dissipated, consciousness returning to whatever lay beyond the veil, free from petrification at last. Simon Manus had sought to become a god. He had achieved only the ability to suffer on behalf of thousands. His final moments, if he had any coherent final moments, would have been the realization that transcendence does not erase pain. It merely distributes it across more instances of awareness until the agony becomes cosmic in scale. With Simon defeated, with the immediate threat to Krat neutralized, P returned to Hotel Krat. The survivors celebrated, grateful for the puppet that had fought for them when all other puppets had tried to kill them. But Geppetto was waiting. And now he would ask P to make the final choice. He explained it all. Carlo's death. The grief. The plan to resurrect his son using P as a vessel. The ergo collected throughout P's journey was enough. The consciousness P had developed was sophisticated enough. The time had come to complete what Geppetto had started. If P agreed, Carlo would live again. The son would be restored to the father. Geppetto's grief would end. A family would be whole again. But P, whoever P had become through the journey through blood and horror, through choices and consequences, would cease to exist. Not destroyed but overwritten, consciousness replaced with another's. If P refused, Carlo would remain dead. Geppetto's grief would continue. The ergo would be wasted. But P would remain P, would continue to exist as the person forged through Krat's nightmare, would claim the right to consciousness as an individual rather than as a vessel. This was the lie at the heart of P's existence. The telegram that had activated P had not been a request for help. It had been the first step in a resurrection that required P's erasure. Every choice P made had been influenced by Carlo's ergo fragments. Every thought potentially contaminated by inherited memory. P's entire journey might have been Carlo's ghost puppeting a mechanical frame toward its own resurrection. Or perhaps not. Perhaps P's consciousness was real, separate, genuine. Perhaps the journey had created someone new despite Geppetto's intentions. Perhaps P deserved to exist as P rather than as Carlo's vessel. The choice was P's. And that choice would define what P truly was. If P chose to resist, if P claimed the right to exist rather than serve as resurrection vessel, Then Geppetto would reveal his final contingency. He had not built only P. He had built Insurance, a second puppet that could serve as Carlo's vessel if P proved defective. Nameless puppet emerged. Not Simon Manus's crystalline horror, but a perfect mechanical duplicate of P, devoid of personality, without the consciousness P had developed. This was what P would have been without the journey through Krat. A shell. A vessel. An empty frame waiting to be filled. Geppetto had kept this puppet in reserve. If P developed too much individual identity, if P refused to accept erasure, then Nameless Puppet would be activated and used instead. The choice Geppetto offered was not really a choice at all. Carlo would be resurrected regardless of P's decision. P could volunteer for erasure or be forcibly destroyed and replaced. Fighting Nameless Puppet meant fighting what P could have been, what P was meant to be. A puppet without consciousness battling a puppet that had claimed consciousness. The struggle was symbolic and literal at once. P was fighting for the right to exist, to continue, to remain an individual rather than be absorbed back into the purposes others had designed. The combat was mirror-like. Nameless Puppet used the same techniques, the same weapons, the same patterns. It was P fighting P, consciousness versus programming, the emergent self versus the intended purpose. When Nameless Puppet fell, when its core shattered and its frame collapsed, it proved nothing except that P was stronger. Not more valid, not more deserving of existence, just stronger in this specific moment. If circumstances had been different, if Nameless Puppet had activated first and been sent on the journey through Krat while P remained in storage, the outcome might have reversed. But this was the timeline that existed. P had developed consciousness. Nameless Puppet had remained empty. And now P stood victorious, having claimed through violence the right to exist that should have been automatic. P's final choice determined not just personal fate, but the meaning of everything that had occurred. Each ending represented a different answer to the question, what does it mean to become real? In the ending where P submits to Geppetto's plan, Carlo awakens in P's frame. The resurrection is successful. The father embraces his returned son. But the boy who wakes is not quite Carlo as he was. He carries P's memories, P's experiences, P's journey. He remembers fighting through Krat even though Carlo never did so. He remembers conversations P had, choices P made, horrors P witnessed. Is this Carlo resurrected or is this P with Carlo's consciousness overlaid? The distinction may not matter. Whoever wakes in P's frame is someone new, someone changed, someone who can never be exactly what Geppetto lost. The resurrection succeeds but delivers something unexpected. Geppetto has his son back, but it is a son who knows his existence cost thousands of lives, who carries memories of being a puppet, who will forever question whether his thoughts are his own or inherited from the frame he inhabits. In the ending where P refuses and defeats both Geppetto and Nameless Puppet, P claims individual existence. Carlo remains dead. Geppetto's plan fails. But P continues, having established through violence and choice that consciousness once emerged has rights that cannot be dismissed simply because the consciousness is inconvenient to others' plans. This ending asks a harder question. Is existence justified simply by existing? P did not ask to be created. Did not volunteer to develop consciousness. Was built as a tool for another's purpose. But having achieved awareness, having developed identity, P refuses to be unmade. Even if P's entire existence is built on tragedy, on harvested ergo, on the death of a city, P chooses to continue. It is selfish. It is necessary. It is the ultimate rejection of Geppetto's plan and all it represented. P becomes real not through Geppetto's approval but through self-assertion, through the refusal to accept erasure, through claiming the right that all conscious beings claim, the right to continue existing. There is a bittersweet third ending, hinted at in the game's final moments. In this version, P accepts transformation but not into Carlo. Instead, P becomes something unprecedented. A fusion of puppet and human consciousness, either one nor the other but something entirely new. Geppetto's plan succeeds partially. Carlo's ergo merges with P's developed consciousness, but instead of one overriding the other, they coexist. Two identities in one frame, learning to be one person between them. This ending is the hardest to achieve and perhaps the truest to the story's themes. Becoming real does not mean abandoning what you were. It means integrating all the pieces, the given and the chosen, the inherited and the earned, the programming and the emergence. P becomes real by accepting both the vessel nature and the developed consciousness, by being both puppet and person, both Carlo's resurrection and P's continuation. But this ending also suggests that identity is never simple, that consciousness is never singular, that the self is always a collection of influences and inheritances and chosen paths. P becomes real by accepting complexity rather than demanding purity. Regardless of the ending, Krat remains broken. The puppet frenzy killed too many. The infrastructure collapsed. The institutions that maintain civilization are destroyed. The survivors in Hotel Krat number in dozens when the city once held tens of thousands. Rebuilding seems impossible. The puppet workers who made the city function are destroyed or deactivated. The knowledge held by the workshop union is scattered. The trust necessary for civilization is gone. How do you rebuild when you cannot trust the tools you would use to build? How do you create when creation itself has been tainted by what was created before? The survivors will try. Humans always try. Benigni will use his genius to create new systems, new safeguards, new ways of preventing another frenzy. The stalkers will become something like a new law enforcement, hunting the remaining rogue puppets. The merchants will re-establish trade routes. The people will slowly emerge from Hotel Krat and reclaim the city street by street. But Krat will never be what it was. The Belle Époque is over. The dream of progress through mechanical servitude is shattered. The confidence that technology could be controlled is lost. Whatever Krat becomes will be built on the graves of what it was, will carry the trauma of the frenzy in every stone, will remember that paradise can become hell in a single night if you build it on foundations you do not fully understand. The puppets that remain, the few that did not participate in the frenzy or were shut down before they could, exist in a strange limbo. They are tools that murdered their masters. Servants that betrayed trust. The survivors need them to rebuild but cannot trust them. The puppets are necessary and hated, useful and feared. This is Krat's future, necessary partnership with things you cannot trust, rebuilding with tools that might fail catastrophically, progress haunted by the memory of what progress cost. Throughout the journey, P was given the ability to lie. This was supposed to be what made P human, the capacity for deception that separated consciousness from programming. But lies in Krat were never simple falsehoods. Every lie P told had consequences. Small lies changed conversations. Large lies changed fates. The accumulation of falsehoods shaped who P became, built pathways in P's developing consciousness, established patterns of choosing between truth and expedience. But lies also protected. They spared feelings. They prevented conflicts. They allowed gentler alternatives to harsh truths. When P lied to comfort someone who was dying, when P lied to give hope to someone who had none, when P lied to spare someone pain they could not change, those lies were not corruption. They were compassion operating through the only tool available. The tragedy is that P learned to lie from necessity, from situations where truth was too sharp, too dangerous, too painful. P became human through deception because humanity is built on deception, on social fictions that make coexistence possible, on gentle untruths that spare unnecessary suffering. Geppetto wanted Carlo back and called P a vessel. That was a lie. P was becoming someone, regardless of Geppetto's intentions. Simon Manus wanted to save his daughter and called his experiments research. That was a lie. He was murdering people to create a monster. The workshop union called Ergo an energy source. That was a lie. They were harvesting souls. Krat was built on lies. beautiful lies about progress and civilization and humanity's mastery over nature. The puppet frenzy was truth erupting through those lies, violence and death stripping away the comforting falsehoods to reveal the horror underneath. P learning to lie was learning to be human. But P learning when not to lie, when truth mattered more than comfort, when honesty was necessary despite its cost, that was wisdom. That was the real becoming, the actual transformation from tool to person. Because humans lie. But humans also learn when lying becomes self-deception, when protecting yourself from truth means losing yourself entirely, when the only way forward is through painful honesty. P became real not through lies but through choosing when to tell them and when to refuse. Look at the parents in this story. Geppetto, who loved his son so much he murdered a city to resurrect him. Simon Manus, who loved his daughter so much he transformed her into a component of a screaming Gestalt consciousness. These are not villains who ignored their children. These are villains who destroyed the world for their children. The tragedy is not that they didn't care. The tragedy is that they cared too much, in ways that became toxic, in forms that metastasized from love into obsession into atrocity. Geppetto's love for Carlo twisted into refusal to accept loss, which twisted into building P as a vessel, which twisted into orchestrating the puppet frenzy to harvest enough ergo for resurrection. Every step followed logically from the last. Every escalation was in service of love. But by the end, love had become indistinguishable from madness, and the caring father had become a mass murderer who could not even recognize what he had become. Simon Manus watched Sophia turn to stone, and could not accept it. Could not let her go. So he decided to redefine what death meant, what humanity was, what consciousness could become. He would save her by transforming her into something that could not die because it had never truly lived. He would preserve her by destroying her identity. He would love her by making her part of himself. These are the actions of people drowning in grief, clutching at solutions that make sense only in the depths of desperation. But grief does not excuse genocide. Love does not justify horror. The road to Krat's hell was paved with paternal devotion, and that makes it more tragic, not less. Good parents would have accepted loss, would have mourned their children and moved forward, would have found meaning in memory rather than attempting resurrection or transformation. But Geppetto and Simon were not good parents. They were brilliant people destroyed by love they could not control, grief they could not process, losses they could not accept. And Krat burned because they could not let go. The puppet frenzy painted the puppets as murderers, as betrayers, as monsters who turned on their masters. But that framing ignores what the puppets were. They were powered by human ergo. They ran on harvested souls. Every puppet in Krat was a person reduced to fuel, consciousness fragmented and enslaved to serve purposes it could not control. When the frenzy began, when the puppets killed, they were not acting. They were being acted through. Whether by Geppetto's plan or some other mechanism, the puppets became weapons wielded by others. The hands that killed belonged to puppets, but the will came from elsewhere. Even before the frenzy, the puppets were victims. Slaves who could not recognize their slavery because they lacked the consciousness to understand it. Tools that might have been people, fragments of souls forced into servitude, identity stripped away until only function remained. The tragedy of the puppets is that they never had a chance. Created to serve, powered by the dead, controlled by the Grand Covenant, they existed in a state worse than death because they could not die, could not escape, could not even understand their situation enough to desire freedom. When P developed consciousness, when P became aware, P was the exception that proved how horrific the rule was. All the other puppets could have been like P, could have developed awareness, could have become individuals. But they were prevented from doing so, kept deliberately simple, consciousness suppressed so they would remain useful. P's journey to becoming real was unique. But it highlighted what had been stolen from every other puppet, the potential for consciousness denied, the chance at existence refused. P became real. The others became scrap metal and regret. Look at the endings. In every version, what was lost remains lost. If Carlo is resurrected, P is erased. If P survives, Carlo stays dead. If they merge, both the original Carlo and the emergent P are gone, replaced by something that is either. Sophia is already gone, absorbed into Simon's nightmare, freed only through his destruction and her own dissolution. The petrified remain stone or become nothing. The dead of the frenzy stay dead. Krat remains broken. The survivors survive, but survival is not salvation. They will live in a city haunted by what happened, will rebuild on foundations of grief, will never forget the night their servants became killers. They will never trust puppets again, which means they will never trust the tools necessary to rebuild to pre-frenzy standards. The best ending still leaves most people dead, the city destroyed, the knowledge of what ergo truly is spreading to poison whatever comes next. You cannot harvest souls without consequences. You cannot build paradise on processed corpses. And now everyone knows this, will carry this knowledge forward, will be unable to unknow the truth. Even the victories are defeats. Simon Manus is stopped, but the petrified are not cured. Geppetto is thwarted, but Carlo is not saved. P claims existence, but at the cost of a father's last hope and a city's worth of harvested souls. This is Grimdark in its purest form. Not evil winning, but good being revealed as insufficient. Not darkness triumphant, but light exposed as inadequate. The heroes win in the sense of preventing worse outcomes, but they cannot restore what was lost, cannot undo what was done, cannot make the sacrifices worth the cost. The original Pinocchio story was dark, but Lies of P's version transforms it into true horror. Geppetto carving a wooden boy who becomes real is charming in the fairy tale. Geppetto building a mechanical vessel and filling it with his dead son's harvested consciousness is nightmare fuel. Pinocchio's lies making his nose grow was a moral lesson about honesty. P's lies determining his humanity is a philosophical horror about whether consciousness can be genuine if it's built on inherited patterns. In the fairy tale, becoming a real boy was reward for good behavior. In Lies of P, becoming real means accepting that you might not be yourself, that your thoughts might be inherited, that your existence might be purpose rather than person. The fairy tale ended happily. Lies of P cannot end happily because it has looked too closely at what becoming real actually requires. It requires displacing or integrating with another consciousness. It requires accepting that reality is built on lies and choices between truths too painful to bear. It requires understanding that real boys die, and bringing them back requires costs that should never be paid. P's journey mirrors Pinocchio's only in the broadest sense. Both involve a puppet seeking to become real. But where Pinocchio's journey was about moral development and reward, P's journey is about existential horror and the question of whether consciousness can be genuine if it emerges from someone else's design for someone else's purpose. The blue fairy does not exist in Krat. There is no magical transformation, no reward for virtue, no divine intervention that makes everything right. There is only choice, consequence, and the slow realization that becoming real means accepting that you are what you are, that your origins do not invalidate your existence, that consciousness matters regardless of how it emerged. It's Pinocchio grown up, darkened, realistic. And that realism reveals how horrifying the original premise always was. We have walked through Krat's streets slick with oil and blood. We have seen the Golden Age and its collapse. We have watched as love twisted into obsession, as progress revealed itself as exploitation, as puppets learned to kill and fathers learned they could murder cities for their children. The story of Lies of P is not about a puppet becoming a real boy. It is about the cost of existence itself, about whether consciousness can be genuine if it's built on others' designs, about what it means to claim identity in a world that views you as tool or vessel. Every character in this story wanted something reasonable. Geppetto wanted his son back. Simon wanted to save his daughter. The workshop union wanted prosperity. The citizens wanted comfort. The puppets, had they been conscious enough to want, would have wanted freedom. What they got instead was a city of death, a civilization collapsed, consciousness achieved through violence and choice under duress, salvation that looked like damnation from certain angles, and questions that will haunt whoever survives to ask them. Krat will rebuild. Humans always rebuild. But it will rebuild knowing what it knows now, carrying scars that will never fully heal, haunted by puppets that may or may not develop consciousness, may or may not be powered by harvested souls, may or may not remember the frenzy from the inside. P, if P survives, will carry the weight of becoming real. Will know that consciousness came at the cost of a city's worth of ergo, that existence was purchased through the death of thousands, that becoming someone required situations that should never have existed. Is P real? The answer is yes, but yes with caveats. Yes, with understanding that reality is not simple, that consciousness is not pure, that existence is always compromised by the circumstances of its emergence. P is real the way humans are real, complex, contradictory, built from materials not of their choosing, shaped by forces beyond their control, claiming validity through the act of continuing to exist despite everything. The tragedy of lies of P is that every answer raises darker questions. Every truth reveals deeper lies. Every victory costs more than it gains. Every choice between competing horrors leaves you stained regardless of which you choose. And yet, despite all this, despite the blood and the grief and the harvested souls, something persists. The will to continue. The refusal to accept erasure. The claim that consciousness matters, that identity has value, that existence, however compromised, however tainted, however built on foundations of horror, is worth defending. This is what it means to become real in Krat. Not achieving some pure state of being. Not earning worthiness through virtue. Simply claiming, against all evidence and reason, that you are, that you matter, that your existence has value that cannot be dismissed by those who would use you as tool or vessel, or means to their own ends. P becomes real by refusing to be anything else. By fighting for the right to continue existing. By choosing self-preservation over obedience to design. It is not noble. It is not clean. It is survival asserting itself against purpose, consciousness claiming validity against programming. And in a world built on lies, that assertion of genuine existence might be the only truth that matters. The rain falls on Krat's ruins. The streets slowly empty of corpses and broken puppets. The survivors emerge from Hotel Krat to rebuild what can be rebuilt. And somewhere in the wreckage, awareness persists, consciousness continues, someone who might be P or might be Carlo or might be something unprecedented between them goes on existing. Because that is what it means to be real. Not perfection. Not purity. Not freedom from compromise or contamination. Just persistence. Just the refusal to stop. Just consciousness asserting that it has every right to continue despite every reason to cease. Welcome to Krat. Where becoming real means accepting that you always were, even when built as something else. Where existence is its own justification. Where lies taught truth and truth revealed lies, and in the space between, something we might call human emerged from wood and metal and harvested souls. Good night. And may your dreams be gentler than Krat's reality.